Okay, I think we've got everyone back in the room. I'm not going to keep on talking because there's no reason to. I'm now introducing you to the afternoon sessions, kicking off with Danielle Spracher, who is the curator at the Westminster Menswear Collection. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a really enjoyable morning. So, yeah. And I'm looking forward to the conversations later as well, very much. So, Ben asked me to speak about the Menswear Archive at the University of Westminster and specifically looking at the objects and collecting and the sort of processes around that. So that's what I'm focusing on today. And the image here is a visit that we had recently from a group from called the Metallic Fund, which is a really interesting sponsored or mentoring program for people of young designers and people interested in fashion of colour. And we had a really great morning with them talking about menswear and the archive. So today I'm going to focus on a sort of a history of the archive and how it was set up, because it's actually a very new collection, and then looking at the processes of collecting in terms of our policies, so kind of leading on from some of the things that were talked about earlier today, and our methods of collecting, which are primarily purchase, and again quite different from a lot of other institutions. We do get donations as well, and the way that the archive has been set up and the way we run it, our ability to be very responsive, which I think is a really key thing for us, which Sean kind of touched on a bit in his talk. And then how that kind of feeds into what we think of as almost a virtuous circle in terms of the way that the archive is used, and then how that reflects on our collecting in going forward and the narratives of the objects that we have in the collection. So in preparation for this, I delved back. The collection, as I said, is quite new. It's only sort of 5-6 years old, as I'll go on to discuss, but I went back into some of the documentation that we have to do with the setting up of the collection, because I started in 2017, so there was quite a lot that happened before I started. And in around 2010, one of the teaching staff at the University of Westminster, Robert Leach, he is interested in historical clothing and teaches menswear in particular. So he had garments that he used in his teaching process, and then that became formalised, and a room was put aside on the same floor as the fashion design studios, and Robert and Andrew Groves, who was the course leader, or head of BA Fashion Design at the time, started to collect more objects. And so that was sort of developed through 2010 to 2014. And it was based primarily on staff donating things. At the same time, Robert was writing a book aimed at fashion design students on menswear and research in menswear. And that has his sort of process of thinking around that, and some of the ideas about sort of archetypes in menswear have really informed our collecting policies since then. And this is just an example of a spread from Robert's book about workwear and how that's reflected in contemporary fashion design. In 2015, Robert and Andrew put together an exhibition based on this idea of archetypes in menswear, in terms of the Oxford English Dictionary definition of an archetype, of it being the original pattern or model from which copies are made, a prototype. And this idea is something that really has driven our collecting, because it resonates so much in menswear. And in 2015, there was the decision it had been in development to start a master's course in fashion design at the University of Westminster, and various things came together which meant that it was decided that it would be purely a menswear fashion design master's course. And that sort of accelerated some of the discussions that were happening already around this fashion resource, these garments that had been collected, to focusing purely on menswear and looking particularly about functionality of design. And so this was reflected in the exhibition as well. So as part of the process of setting up the MA menswear, the teaching staff were constantly confronted by the architects basically misunderstanding what this course was going to be. So people from the time said they were constantly being shown these architectural drawings of the studios with female mannequins, with this infamous woman in a red dress that seemed to keep appearing, despite the fact that the title was menswear. That didn't seem to get through to the architects. So again, this was something that really meant that there was sort of a lot of reflection by Andrew and other people involved about what menswear is, why it's been ignored, why actually it was really important to just focus on menswear for this collection. And there were a few other things as well that were influencing this decision. And one of the main ones was a man called Massimo Osti, who was an Italian designer and started CP Company in Stone Island. Stone Island has become much more sort of known, I suppose. More recently, they're now owned by Moncler. But CP Company was the first company that he started. They celebrated their 50th anniversary last year. But Osti was really interesting in terms of the way he designed. He wasn't trained as a fashion designer. He never considered himself to be a fashion designer. And all of his companies were primarily about menswear. They drew very heavily on the tradition and heritage and experience of production in Italy, particularly textile design. Osti worked very closely with some quite big textile companies who did research and development on his behalf. And he also collected vintage garments. And he was particularly interested in military uniform and workwear. And he developed several different collections. One of them was sold after he died. There were about 30,000 objects apparently in it to a Chinese collector, and it's now in a Chinese museum collection. But the family also still retained a collection. But he worked with the objects very directly, and you can see that in this image here, where his son tells a story about in the late 70s, early 80s, being able to get hold of a very large scale photocopier, one of the sort of early ones in Italy. It was very large, so he was photocopying garments, playing with scale, and using that on the actual garments, as you can see here. So it was very integral to his design process. This is his the archive that now is of Osti in Bologna, and it's owned by the family. So although he sold these various archives over the years, he did retain quite a lot of pieces, and they are now housed in Bologna. And again, it's been very informative to what we do. And one of the other ones, sort of areas of collecting, which has been influential, are the commercial collections. And there was discussion earlier about sort of hiring things out from collections. And there are a number that focus particularly on men, or solely on menswear, and one of the most well-known ones is the vintage showroom. I'm embarrassed to say I still have not actually been to the collection, even though it's only in West London. But they, again, focus very heavily on workwear, military uniform. And I didn't realise until recently, but they stop in the early 70s. So they actually don't collect it. They don't have anything sort of beyond the early 70s, which is quite interesting. But these archives, the design archives, individual designer archives, but these commercial archives are also interesting because they work incredibly closely with the fashion industry. And designers go and use those archives very directly. They hire pieces from them to use as part of their design process. So that was also something that informed what we were doing right early on from the beginning, because it was about being able to sort of replicate the kinds of things that our students would be doing in industry, but while they were students, and modelling that. And it's also allowed us to do a huge number of other things as well. One of the main ones is maintain relationships with our alumni. I'll talk about that later on. By 2016, the collection had grown, and we had about 200 menswear garments. And I read in one of the documents that apparently there was an industry project which funded some purchasing. Looking at Andrew. And so there were donations from staff, and then this sort of late 2015, 2016 period, we were starting to actually purchase objects primarily from eBay, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. Then we had these 200 menswear garments, and they had started cataloguing the collection as well. And we had a lot of support from our great team in our university records and archives, who set up some of the basic structures that we've used since then, including using museum accessioning processes, so giving everything an accession number, so it's an individual number for that object. And this is one of the early ones that we purchased, which is a very a grail for a lot of collectors. It's a CP company piece from, now I'm going to date, Andrew, is it 98? Oh, was it 2000? Yeah, that's right, it's 2000. So it was when Massimo Osti was still designing for CP Company. It's very heavily referencing military uniforms. And we spoke to the other designer, Moreno Ferrari, who said they spent a year on this on the design of this. Clearly not only working on this design, but it wasn't a sort of fast fashion process. It was a slow process of, and they kept adding details to it. It's a really beautiful jacket. Also in 2016, Andrew and Robert put together an exhibition on camouflage, which again meant that that sort of drove some of the collecting, because military uniform has been so incredibly important in the history of menswear, as we can see here, and so it enabled us to buy some really interesting pieces. So we have military uniform and camouflage from quite a number of European and American countries, as well as the UK, and then also designer versions of those, of camouflage and the use of camouflage in menswear. So the key kind of moment for us was in 2016. The University of Westminster has a very long, convoluted history, which I cannot I don't have a handle on at all. But as a result of it, we have a trust called the Quinton Hogg Trust, which operates to support teaching and learning within the University of Westminster, but is separate from the University of Westminster. And they have quite a lot of money, which they are able to give for various purposes. And in 2016, it was the first year that they'd come up with a model of competitive bidding for funds. And Andrew put in a bid for £350,000 for a 3-year project to build a collection. And we got it, which is how I managed to get my job, which I'm very, very thankful for. And we had to, I wasn't there at that point, but a bid had to be put together. with a business case. And originally the idea was at the end of the 3 years, the archive would be self-funding. When I went for my interview, I was like, okay, somehow I don't quite think it's going to happen. But I also didn't understand the way that industry used commercial archives at that point, and actually how much money they spend. It is quite extraordinary. So the model of what the archive now is was basically in that bid, and the documentation and the processes that had been put together for that, in terms of it being primarily a teaching collection, so for primarily our fashion design students, but it is open to any students across the board at our university and externally. And in that sense, it was always designed to be a collection which you touch and that the students have access to in a very direct way and an unmediated way, in that students come in and use the collection. They don't, I am there, but I'm not looking over their shoulder. So that's our primary purpose. And then secondary is that we work with industry. So our objects are available for hire, and that commercial side has allowed us to do quite a lot of things that we would not otherwise be able to do, particularly once the Quinton Hogg money came to an end. So it means that we can generate our own income, which we have control over, which is quite extraordinary. And I keep expecting someone in the university to come along and stop it, but so far that hasn't been the case, which is great. And as part of that, because of our focus on menswear, it's enabled us to bring together this real diverse range of objects, which I think is quite unique in terms of the types of things that we have all in one room together. So when I started, we had about 800 garments, and it's now up to nearly 2,000. So this is what the archive looks like now. So it's in a big room, we have roller racking. But as I said before, most of the use is you can come and browse the collection, and you can touch it. And students, they don't have to know what they're looking for necessarily when they come in, which means that they can, the joy of serendipity and of finding things that they maybe didn't even realise that they were looking for, or things that they didn't know we had. And it's meant that we can have all these great juxtapositions of things. So on the table in this image is a McQueen coat, which is based on an 18th century sleeved waistcoat, and then in the box is a transfer that came from a Leeds Council teaching collection, schools collection, which is an embroidered 18th century coat, which has been hacked around, lined with poly cotton, and it's a bit of a mess, but it's a great piece to be able to use for teaching. And I'll talk about the sort of date range of what we cover, because that has shifted. So going on to collecting. And policies and how you make these decisions, because menswear is a huge area, and we have focused down on certain things, but that has also changed, and we've been able to respond to those changes, even in the short time that we've been in existence. And as I said before, the professional support from the University Records and Archives team has been great, so we have a very good institutional archive. And they also, although it's called the Westminster Menswear Archive, my background is in museums, and when I started, I was like, this is a collection, not an archive, which might seem sort of a bit of a pedantic difference, but there is a difference in process. And but in fashion design terms, I quickly came to understand the use of the term archive is quite common to describe these kinds of garment collections. But my colleagues in the archives team said, we're not curators, we need a curator. So again, it meant that I could come in and be a curator rather than archivist, which does have slight differences, I think. But the primary, and the documentation I sort of had a look at, an early draft was dominated by, that I'm not sure who wrote it, I think it was probably Andrew, but I'm not sure, was dominated by the aim to collect design that was technical and functional. And it's really interesting looking at those documents, and although it's within the context of fashion design and a fashion design department and all of these things, this idea of design and functionality comes up all the time. And I think that is, again, one of the things that makes it menswear different from women's wear often. So in this early draft, it said that the collection would be international in remit, with particular emphasis on the UK, Europe and the USA, which is what we've done. The clothing, accessories and documents in the archive will focus on technical and functional menswear from both an industrial and fashion perspective, and concentrate the archive on examples from Europe and the US, which we've continued to do. The definition of functional menswear as garments intended for men to wear that are principally designed with specific functionality in the process of design. And then also there is a point made about providing insight into the society of which the garment came from, and that the documentation of these objects was important as well. So all of those things were right there from the beginning. There was also a point about that design operates on a global level, and thus we collect from all over the world. And these are some of the things that we've sort of revisited because it was so broad in scope. So we now have a collection development policy, which was ratified by the university, which has sort of defined some of these things because we realised we just couldn't focus on everything. And this is our future collecting priorities. And the term, the date, post-1900, is something which has shifted. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. But we have pretty much kept to this idea of these priorities, particularly around workwear, working clothing. And we've focused since 2019 on British companies, although British companies or designers or garments that have had an influence on British clothing. So again, we haven't tied ourselves down completely because of this, the international nature of fashion itself. And again, the term archetypal is there because of its importance within menswear. And then also it's important for us to have examples of pieces from students because we know historically fashion design, even with universities or colleges that have museum collections, or often fashion is, or art and design collections, often fashion has been neglected and there aren't examples of fashion work. So that was really important to us. So every year we purchase an outfit from the BA and the MA student work. And despite the current budget cuts that are happening, I was told yesterday that we're still going to have some ring-fenced money for that, which is really great. And it's been incredibly useful. It's really great for the current students to see past students' work. And actually, because of the way the students are doing their final collections, they're often doing quite experimental things. They're trying things out. So again, it's really great to have examples of that. And then our grails, the things that we really, and it's a very long list of things we would like to have, but we've worked quite hard on, for example, underwear and sportswear since 2019, because we were really lacking on those aspects. On trousers too, we had an awful lot of coats, but no bottom halves, so we'll be getting more trousers. So yes, on to actually how we have done this collecting. I just looked on our eBay account, and so on the side there is a screen grab of the 149 searches that we've got saved on eBay. So when we started with the QHT money, we had roughly £150,000 each year. Some of that went on my salary and other sort of operating costs and stuff, but I suppose £50,000-60,000 a year to spend. And we also, it was also really important to sort of build the collection quickly, to have a collection so that then people would understand what we were doing. And we still do, I was speaking earlier to some people here, we still have a lot of communicating we have to do, even to our internal colleagues, about what the archive is. Some people get it and they walk into the room of all these clothes and they immediately understand it, but we still have colleagues who don't, which is frustrating. But some of the colleagues who do are amazing. So our head of estates at Harrow, where we're based, he loves the archive. It's one of his favourite places at Harrow. He always brings visitors round because he understands how important it is. There are other more senior members of management who don't. I don't understand. But so building the collection quickly was important, and I mean part of that as well was this the QHT money. It was over 3 years, but we had to spend the money, like it was divided into 3, and we had to spend the money, at the end of the financial year. Otherwise, we would lose it. We couldn't carry it over. So there was this sort of imperative to spend, but also, we could have bought one garment for £60,000, but we didn't do that because of all sorts of reasons, security, looking after it, but also not being able to then have the breadth of the collection that we've got. So our spending is between £5-10 up to about £3,000. That's kind of the most we've paid, £3,500. So we haven't spent a lot. Andrew said he's noticed that the market has changed even in that time that we've been going in terms of the value put on menswear, which is really interesting. And there's some things that we bought early on that have gone up in value, but compared to women's wear, it's still less, I think, overall. But as I said, because we had this money from the QHT, which operated outside of the university, as it were, we've had a lot of independence, and that's meant that we have been able to do things like buy on eBay, buy from other online auction sites. And Andrew said, I think in other situations, if eBay didn't exist, it would be hard to know how we would have been able to do it, because he was running the BA Fashion for the whole time as well as his full-time job. So this was sort of on top of what we were doing anyway. But did you have 99 alerts at one point? Yeah. Each day. And again, I mean, there is that serendipity, like I think Alistair was talking about earlier, with sometimes you do find things that you never think that you would be able to find, but then there's other situations where we've been looking for ages for things and they're just we know they're out there, but they're not turning up in the places that we see. So yeah, but yeah, we've been lucky in that respect. We also buy from auctions, so this is something we bought from Kerry Taylor. You might notice, and it's interesting, and this is from the Kerry Taylor catalogue, and they had to put it on a female mannequin to display it, which is kind of interesting because of the size. And again, I think it just shows how menswear sort of, it's an afterthought, it's a secondary thing, it's not sort of treated necessarily the same way that women's wear is. And the reason we have expanded sort of pre-1900 is that, driven by teaching actually, because the fashion design, the process, and I think this is common across fashion design courses, they do a shirt project, they do a tailoring project, and we realised that actually it was really important for them to see some of the earlier examples of shirts and tailoring, so that they weren't just looking at kind of 20th century versions of things because of this amazing history that we have in this country of tailoring. So that's why we've been collecting a bit earlier as well. And methods of manufacture and cutting. And students are interested in historical pieces, they're not only interested in more contemporary stuff. And then donation. So right from the beginning we took donations from staff primarily, but since then we've had some quite amazing donations. We got a collection of pieces from our alumni, Liam Hodges, which was largely because he had his own design archive, but he was having to, as a young designer, he was having to move studios all the time, couldn't necessarily look after it as he would like, and so he gave it to us, which is fantastic. We use it a lot. Students really appreciate being able to see it. We got contacted in 2017 on Instagram, or they'd seen us on Instagram from the Calvin Klein archive in New York, and they had been going through their collection. Their creative director of menswear had just left, and they gave us 60 pieces from this very specific period in time. And when they got in touch, they sent us all these pictures, and it was lots of kind of greyish in the pictures. And I was like, this doesn't look very interesting. And Andrew said, no, say yes. Okay, to everything. It's like, okay. They sent it all to us, and then because I was really busy, the boxes were in the corner of the archive for about 3 months before I even was able to unpack them. But when we did, they've been amazing. And again, it's that sort of, you have to see the objects and touch them and to understand them. Incredible technical detail. Really, they've been really useful, important pieces for us now. So, this demob suit was given to us by a woman who contacted Leeds museums. They have demob suits in the collection, so they directed her to us. So we've had a few of those situations where museum curators haven't been able to take things and have sent people to us, which is great. We've had family pieces. Peter Jensen also gave us some pieces as well. So we're building that side of what we do. And then in terms of responsiveness, and it was interesting, I looked one of the documents I looked at was, things we ought to have in the collection, and one of them was an MA1, and we kept kind of thinking, of course we've got an MA1, and then like, no, we don't actually have one. We have an Alpha Industries version, but this we bought for our Invisible Men exhibition, and we had a whole section on flight jackets and the influence of sort of military flight and bomber jackets in fashion. And Andrew did quite a lot of research, and we ended up with not actually an MA1, so we still don't have an MA1, but this is the precursor to the MA1, a modified B15 from the 1950s, and we are able to be responsive to exhibitions, teaching, and as Sean said earlier, requests from colleagues, which is really exciting because it means that it's not just myself and Andrew making the decisions, that we're actually able to have other voices within our collecting. And that's become more important, I suppose, and other perspectives. But it does mean that when, say, we're putting together an exhibition and we realise that we don't have things, we can go and look for them and we can purchase them if they're a reasonable price. Or if students suggest certain things, or it's clear that the teaching is going in a particular direction. And then research elements as well. So we're doing something around linen at the moment, and we've been able to purchase for that. These again were pieces that we acquired for Invisible Men. This is Burberry, and again showcases what the archive has enabled us to do in terms of our relationships with our alumni. So at the moment at Burberry we have, how many alumni are at Burberry on the menswear team? 5? 5 or 6. They come in and use the collection with Burberry. Oh, am I allowed to say that? I think we are. And then it means that we can also talk to Burberry about certain particular things. But we really wanted this because it was Christopher Bailey's final collection. And then because of our connection with alumni, we found out the sort of story behind how it was done. It was very last minute. They did get an original railway high-vis, and it was sent to a factory in Italy and copied or reimagined. It has really amazing Burberry detail, so all the poppers are Burberry. It has a Burberry quilted lining, and some of the sort of scale has been exaggerated. So again, it's a great piece to talk about that influence between what is design, what is not, how much design do you need to do to something to turn it into a fashion object as opposed to a uniform. And then I think Alistair was talking earlier, or somebody mentioned about mistakes. So the helmet Lang we bought for our exhibition. It had been on Grailed for a while. We bought it, and then doing research for the object labels, Andrew got in touch with Helmut Lang as the company and said, we have these pieces, can you give us some more information about them? They said, we don't know about our history because the company's been sold at least once or twice since Lang left. And they said, there's this collector who is the one that knows, who has an incredible collection of Lang, and he'll be able to tell you. So he was very helpful and said, oh, I know that jacket, I've seen it around. That's not an original painted jacket. It's been faked. The denim jacket is real Helmut Lang, but somebody has painted it. And you wouldn't know that until you really look at it, because apparently the original process that Lang did, unsurprisingly, was a print process to create the paint effect. But this has been painted, somebody has painted it. And at first we were like, what do we do? But then we thought, no, that's really interesting. Somebody has bothered to go to that process. They put their individual stamp on it. It's on Grailed, which apparently, supposedly things are authenticated. There's all these interesting things around how things are bought and sold. Yeah. So that's one of our mistakes. We have others. And again, responding to what's available and what comes up. So we've been buying quite a lot of Joe Casserly-Hayford, which has been really amazing because I knew his name, but actually seeing the pieces has been really inspiring because of how important he was in British fashion and also in menswear, and sort of comparing that to the pieces that we have from people like McQueen and also Jean-Paul Gaultier from that kind of period, and a lot of the make is really interesting. So we've now got about 15, I think, pieces from sort of 80s, 90s Casserly-Hayford, which is great. And then just finishing, as I mentioned before, and now we've been going sort of 5-6 years, we're allowing these sort of new ideas and people to help us with the collecting and the uses of the objects. And a lot of that is through the industry hire that we do. And because my background is in museums, I found that really, really hard to start with, to get my head around. And one of the designers came in and he said, when we take stuff away, we'll do this, this, and this with it. I was like, don't tell me. Don't tell me what you're going to do. And we get objects back with big labels tied onto them, sometimes from some companies that say, Westminster Menswear Archive, do not cut. Like, thank you for putting the labels on. But it is a really interesting process because it's another narrative which is often invisible and people don't know about, but we're recording it. We have all the, and it's really interesting seeing what objects designers choose to hire and the phases that they go through in terms of what it is literally in fashion or not. And there are some objects which have gone out numerous times. And I think probably most people who work in commercial archives would say the same thing, or they would say the same thing. So that's really interesting to see that process. And as I said before, it's helped us with our alumni because most of the industry people that have come in are alumni who are coming back to use us commercially. So we build that process sort of and see the results of that process, and we can continue to support our alumni, which is great. And then exhibitions as well. So as I said earlier, in 2021, CP Company celebrated their 50th anniversary, and they did a whole lot of events during the year, including this amazing exhibition in a 1960s car park in Darwin in Lancashire. And so we lent several objects to that. And again, because of the nature of our collection, when they said everything's going to be squished between panels of glass, we were like, okay, we can do that. And again, it meant that we had a relationship with them already. Objects from our collection were photographed for their book. It meant that we were able to do education things with them. They've subsequently donated pieces to the collection. So we have this industry connection as well, which has been really rewarding and challenging in other ways. But it was a fantastic project to be involved with. And the exhibition went to Milan as well, but only over a very short period of time. Yeah. That's all I had.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Just a couple of quick questions, please, before we move on. Does anyone have any questions for Danielle?
Yeah.
What about with donations? So women's collections often you just get on wedding dresses because it's what people say. Is there a particular garment that men say?
So far, no. I'm trying to think of anything that I have said no to. There were some suits where I took a few more than I probably should have. The guy was really lovely. He was really nice. And my research is on that I did for my PhD was on the Leeds tailoring industry, and they were from a Leeds tailor called Hepworth's. So there was that kind of connection. So I did know quite a bit about the pieces. So yeah, I probably should have only taken one or two, and I said yes to 5. So yeah, but so far, no. I don't think so. Can you think of anything we've said no?
Turn down all those ties.
Oh yes, I forgot about those. Yes, it was an odd collection of ties that we turned down. So we tend to collect full garments rather than, we do have some accessories, but we haven't focused on that. So it's sort of things that come in with other things as opposed to maybe deliberately collecting accessories.
Could you maybe just speak a little bit more about the kinds of pedagogy that it allows you to practice, having this amazing archive? It must make teaching a much more sort of dynamic process that you've got access to these wonderful things to.
I suppose for me, because I've always, in terms of museums, I've worked with objects. I primarily do one-to-one type teaching, which I really enjoy. So I'm responding to the kinds of questions that students are asking me, and they might say, "Oh, I'm looking for pockets," or have you got examples of this kind of thing? Or I've had recently surfing, something else, and we don't have any surfwear, but I could say we've got these other things that might be useful. So it's sort of, yeah, in that sense, it's really great. I know Andrew, more directly in terms of fashion design teaching, you find it.
It's just really useful. I was teaching on the MA this week, which is the room next door, and I could say, actually, this donkey jacket, have a look at this and bring the object next to their garment. And primarily that's to do with fabrication, materiality, and finish. So, and part of the reason the archive started was the fact that all the students were looking at garments online, so they weren't actually encountering actual objects. And this is why bringing them straight into the studio.
Yeah, so a lot of that is being able to look at the inside of things, finishing details, manufacturing details, and you can kind of do comparisons between and look at sort of factory made stuff, also things that have been altered, and actual materials as well. You know, unfortunately, often students will come in and say, "Where can I get this? Why? How do you think this was made?" Oh, I don't know. Especially kind of 1940s military stuff. I would love to know more about the technical details of a lot of things, which I don't yet. So it gets them curious about all these other processes as well, I think. And also something I try and do is put the objects into a context, because I think that is one of the dangers of what we have. So when people look through the rails, we have a basic tag with what the object is, and the date if we know it, and materials, and we have more information on our online catalogue. But it does mean that things that are looked at sort of as a design object without necessarily being situated, and we do have some quite problematic objects in the collection. Some of the military uniform, various other things, which we have pieces from the 1995 Sleep Com de Garçon collection, which was quite problematic, and we've got about 5 pieces from that collection, which I think sometimes are just looked at as aesthetic for their aesthetic without a proper understanding of the background. But that's a responsibility that I think I have to try and make students aware of this. You know, they have to be more careful sometimes about how they use things. Yeah, so that's an ongoing one.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
No, just really quickly, I was going to ask, you with the intention, you said, to extend the archive further, potentially.
So in terms of money, we have a very small operating budget at the moment from the university, but we do generate income. So at the moment, it varies wildly from between about £10,000 to about £50,000 a year, and we can use that to expand the collection. So we are still purchasing and buying.
And just one thing with the one you mentioned there, subcultural practice press.
Yeah.
So what would the ethos be there? But what would be the sort of selection process
in
relation to your overall kind of functional approach?
Because it's been so influential, and it's the kind of thing that students are always asking for. But it's hard to get because of the personal associations that people have with it, usually.
So things that look functional, a bit like, say, those things you had at Berg and things like that, things that sort of.
Oh, I see what you mean.
contain
Sorry. No, I mean they don't have to be functional.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danielle. That was wonderful. So, our next speaker is Sina Madsen. She's a PhD student based here at London College of Fashion, University of the Arts, London. She's also one of the PhD students within the centre that I manage, the Centre for Fashion Curation. Take it away.
Thank you. So, my PhD research is concerned with worn clothing acquired into public collections, specifically how the curator encounters and experiences these objects, and how in turn this experience might impact the analysis of the object, the reading of wearer biography contained in the object, and the subsequent documentation of that biography. Part of what I term in my research is curatorial interruption. While my discussion today will touch on some aspects of my research working closely with masculine dress in the LCF archives here and the Museum of London, I'm also going to speak on another aspect of my curatorial practice, the interpretation and display of wearer biography and imagining possible modes of exhibiting this biography. I'm considering this in the light of what David Howes referred to in 2014 as a turn towards sensory museology. This movement is continuing to question the sometimes myopic emphasis on sight in curation, a preoccupation that has extended to the curation of clothing. In the case of dress and textiles, this is in part due to necessary conservation that ensures collections' survival into the future. However, today I want to consider curatorial modes of exhibiting worn biography that aren't necessarily about a carefully mounted object, material object in a glass case, or visible objects full stop. My own turn to the sensory and exhibitions, so to speak, was inspired in part by craving a more textual reading of worn biography for visitors, something more akin to the experience those of us who have the privileged position to work closely with objects in collections have. Additionally, and I don't want to give COVID too much credence, but it had a severe impact on my research over the last couple of years as collections and exhibitions just completely shut down. And it really highlighted how reliant my own curatorial practice was on visible material objects, and I wanted to take, the opportunity that COVID presented to challenge that. To that end, my initial research into masculine attire, as we'll call it, came about 6 years ago when I began my research into the Francis Golding collection, an extensive acquisition of one man's worn, primarily though not exclusively Western, 20th and 21st century clothing. His collection was donated by his partner after Golding's death in 2013 to the Museum of London Dress and Textiles collection and here at LCF Archives. What captured my interest about the collection particularly was Golding's method, whether intentional or not, of documenting his life through the objects he gathered and retained on his dressed self in his pockets. And this is one jacket from his collection at the Museum of London and the pocket contents that were found on it. Ranging from, and across his wider collection of clothing, pocket contents ranged from lip balm to theater tickets, self-portraits to dried leaves. And these objects make material documents of Golding's journey through the world. They became integral parts of the garments, so much so that object analysis of the garments used by Golding to store pocket contents show increased signs of wear over the ones that he didn't. Although Golding died without leaving explicit testimony about each of the collected garments, a small selection of his writing where he discusses acquiring and wearing certain pieces of his clothing have been taken by the Museum of London collection. His words, taken together with his pocket contents, therefore can provide valuable added testimony to how he experienced his dressed life. I framed this aspect of my research within Joanne Eicher's theory of the conscious self materialized through the dressed body, that our public, private, and secret selves are embodied through what we wear. By its very nature of being used to carry our daily stuff close to our bodies, but is also being an intimate and concealed space, the pocket can be a neat example of all these potential dressed selves. And pocket contents, when considered as an extension of our dressed selves, can appear to the outsider as common ephemera and also be incredibly meaningful mementos to the wearer, representing materialized evidence of our private and secret selves as we move through the public sphere. Considering pocket contents in this way has enriched my understanding of the garments and in turn the wearer who gathered them. I've twice had the opportunity to use pocket contents in an exhibition setting. In 2017 at the Museum of London in Francis Golding's sartorial biography, where you can see some of his pocket contents from this. This was an aquascutum jacket, I believe, with the pocket contents on display below, further illustrating his work with English heritage, where he wore the jacket. And then in 2018, the Sacred Profane, where I displayed a Neutrogena lip balm of Golding's as a type of religious relic, owing to the close contact it had with his corporeal self, and how it had become representative of him now that his body was gone. As you can see, both of these displays were carefully mounted material objects behind glass cases, so they fall under that site-centric curatorial preoccupation I mentioned. Sarah Chong Kwan has critiqued this ocular focus in curation, questioning in part how it might negate the subjective perspective of the wearer. I consider curation of worn clothing a moment of connection between the visitor and the wearer, creating an opportunity for empathy and understanding of other people's lives. Being able to engage senses other than vision in creating exhibitions of worn clothing can create a more complex experience for the visitor. So how can sensory museology be translated into the exhibition of masculine dress? I'd like to discuss 3 possible modes of exhibiting worn biography through discussion of 2 exhibitions where I've used sound and scent, and then discuss the beginnings of my research into touch in working with garments. In 2019, I curated the exhibition Requiem, Material Memory at the Horse Hospital Gallery in Bloomsbury. Using worn garments from the Contemporary Wardrobe Collection, which was previously mentioned by Sean, a for-hire archive of 20th and 21st century clothing, I wanted to explore, these are grand themes, the truth and tangibility of memory and recollection, nostalgia, and what remains of us in our clothing once we are gone. The exhibition included some pieces of masculine attire, including this garment on the right of the slide, a bespoke Turnbull and Asser shirt owned and worn by the artist Sebastian Horsley, embedded with significant marks from his body and life. As I was curating within a working archive of clothing, I was able to move outside of the standards for handling and mounting garments that are a necessary part of the traditional museum space. This freedom allowed me to explore alternative ways to display the garments, including the use of a soundscape. You can see on the right side of the slide a couple of microphones and a jacket. I wanted to capture the sound of embodied biography in clothing, the sound of wear, and also the ghostliness of these now empty vessels. So I worked with composer and producer Jonah Falco to record the garments that would be exhibited. So we spent an evening in the empty horse hospital with the garments, and we put contact mics in and around inside of the garments and outside of them, and recorded me wearing them, doing up buttons, zipping and unzipping, walking, gesturing. Again, all a benefit of working with a collection of clothing that could be manipulated in this way. Jonah then edited these sounds, slowing them down and stretching them out to where they became difficult to discern and nebulous. An aural, A-U-R-A-L, in case my accent is not clear, rendering of memory. So I'm just going to play the actual loop. Ended up being 16 minutes, but I'll just play a few seconds of it. More recently, I contributed a piece to the group exhibition Ode to Meat Yard, also at the Horse Hospital, which was open just past April. A show that called on contributors to consider the role of clothing in the world of surrealist art. I focused on the surrealist muse and patron Marchesa Luisa Casati. Now, this isn't strictly masculine attire, but I'm fudging it a bit because, as I'll tell you, what I exhibited wasn't attire or gendered at all. One of the fascinating things about Casati is that by the time of her death in 1957, her vast wealth had been spent. The incredible clothing that she had worn and which had helped establish her as an embodied piece of art in her lifetime was long gone, pawned, or given away. Other than the many artists' depictions of her that she commissioned in her lifetime, there's very little of her left that exists in the public realm. And this is material. I mean, you look at any collection, really, and these are holes that you can see existing across them for many different individuals and groups of people. It's certainly not unique to her. What I wanted to express in my display then was that absence of material that had touched Casati's body, which she used to construct her image. I wanted to take what can be a very meaningful element of worn garments, scent, to create a representation of Casati. This was in part inspired by Peter Stallybras's writing Worn Worlds, where he writes about how scent embedded in clothing can become a tangible memory of the person who wore it long after they are gone. So, referring to accounts of her appearance and living conditions from people who knew her during the end of her life, I created a fragrance that incorporated these testimonies. The scent of leather from her well-worn kid gloves, the belladonna she used to keep her eyes huge and shiny towards the end of her life, alcohol and incense from the cramped rooms she rented in London where she spent her days drinking and practicing the occult. Even a whiff of wet fur to represent the aging pack of Pekingese dogs that she kept as her companions, having them taxidermied as they died one by one. Once I had mixed this fragrance, it was kept under a bell jar in a darkened tent in the corner of the gallery where visitors could experience the scent as though Casati had only just left the room, and perhaps even be transported through the olfactory triggers to memories individual to their own experience. Moving now into haptic engagement in clothing, touch, which is possibly one of the more difficult ones, I want to consider an element of my current PhD research which looks at curatorial subjectivity, but within the symposium context of exhibiting masculine attire. Using technology from LCF's Digital Anthropology Lab, I've created 3D renderings of several garments from the LCF archives. Here you can see a pair of espadrilles from the Francis Golding collection in the photogrammetry rig, which currently uses 60 digital cameras, and I think they're going to up it to about 120 at some point, hopefully in the near future, to capture images of the objects, which are then meshed to create a 3D version of the garment. Here's the digital version of these espadrilles, which can be manipulated, zoomed in and out on, and rotated using a trackpad or mouse. And I did do a lot of the digital editing myself, so there's some chunky bits. There's professionals who do a far better job. This ability to manipulate the garment, this type of haptic engagement with the digital garments, is currently also being used in the Tramway Gallery exhibition, Dressing Above Your Station, which has been curated by Becca Lipscomb and Mari Mackenzie. There it is. The exhibition is situated online in a digital replica of Glasgow Tramway's T2 Gallery. This exhibition has also used photogrammetry as a tool to examine the life and work of the Scottish artist Stephen Campbell. And they've captured some of Campbell's garments. You can see a selection of Comme des Garçons garments there, which visitors can pull off the rack in the exhibition to manipulate and do exactly as with the espadrilles, spin them around and zoom in and take a closer look at. This digital view gives more detailed and intimate access to the clothing on display than visitors to exhibitions of fashion in traditional museums are ordinarily granted by allowing this tactile manipulation of the garments. All of these modes of exhibition, sound, scent, and touch, are used to explore what Ellen Sampson calls wornness, which is the experience of wearing and being in clothing. But using these techniques, which engage other senses than the visual to explore wearer biography, are certainly not without their limitations, and not just if you've got, kind of middling Photoshop skills like myself. Certainly in my creation of the Requiem soundscape, it was the ability to touch and wear the garments during the recording that allowed me to create that kind of audio experimentation. With Scent and the Absent Muse, I was creating something based on secondhand written testimony of a person's appearance, so it was an entirely confected representation of Casati. Though I can and do argue that any type of curation is a confected representation of a person if you're using worn clothing. So, on a practical level, ensuring that the scent remained for the duration of the exhibition was contained within that particular display also required additional care. With digital haptics, such as has been used in my PhD research and in Dressing Above Your Station, there can be frustrations at the ability to actually feel the texture of the garment, which Danielle spoke to earlier, wherever Danielle is, and about the hasty of the garment, that there's something uncanny valley and off-putting at looking at something that's real but not real. It's not the genuine article. There are also additional issues to consider with accessibility to technology and equipment for curators and museums or collections who might want to use these modes, and for individual visitor usability. However, these aren't unique issues to these exhibition techniques, and the more work that is created, the more these issues can find solutions. So I just want to end my talk now by inviting you to take a look at an object also from LCF Archives at the web address on the slide. So if you have your phone handy. Oh, you're here. I was like, You'll recognize it. And while you look that up, I'm going to start passing the parcel around. This is Suederol fragrance oil. So if you want to, as you're looking at this jacket, which hopefully some of you are loading up, is it working? If you're seeing a green jacket, just say yeah. Yeah, okay. So hopefully it's loaded up for the majority of you anyways. But this suede jacket belonged to and was worn by the Australian-born fashion PR and consultant Piercy Savage. As you examine the digital rendering of the garment and hopefully get a chance to smell the Suederol that I'm passing around in a cup because it's quite potent, I hope it provides a moment of connection for you, an opportunity to experience his worn garment through an intervention which uses alternative interpretations of vision, touch, and scent. Most of all, I hope my words today have contributed to helping us think through methods of removing those glass cases that contain the essential biography embedded in worn clothing. Thank you.
While my phone is still loading a green color.
Sorry.
I know it's coming because my phone...
I should have done like a U2 style, like somehow Bluetooth dropped it onto everybody's phones, whether you like it or not.
My phone is clunky free. Does anyone have any questions for Sian?
A little bit. And because it's such a complex and rich and nuanced area, so, I mean, with any kind of research, but particularly PhD research, you ring fence your kind of little zone. And my work is very much about people who are working with collections now. So there's certainly a visitor engagement aspect of it, but it's just not the way I'm approaching the research. But I would love to see somebody do it. It would be fantastic. Yeah.
I'm blown away. I'm fascinated by how you captured the scent. Did you use like aldehydes or did you?
I think I'm like an amateur perfumier, very amateur. It was fragrance oils that were stable, because the main thing too, because I'm not a chemist and I'm not a parfumier, that I didn't want people getting a whiff of something that wasn't stable. So I used pre-existing fragrance oils.
And one other thing to add to that, obviously you've got houses like Margiela and people like that who sort of capture particular fragrances, like a beach walk and things like this. Do you think they would play influence what you're doing, or do you think you'll develop that side of things further maybe? Or
I mean, I'm not not consciously or directly influenced by their work, because it's what I have done and what I'm interested in doing is very much reactive to collected worn clothing, and so it would be it's to the individual I'm reacting to, rather than kind of like a larger concept of an experience.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions for Simon?
Okay.
Yeah.
Those things that were found in his pockets.
Yeah.
I missed this. Were they deliberately put there by him? Like it's
Wow. Well, we should have a chat later. It's a huge question. My research, I think it was, but Francis is not with us to confirm that. So yeah, based on my research, I do believe he was an incredible documentarian and collector. To me, and he was by all accounts a very witty and very cognizant person about who he was in time. And so for him to, stick a photo booth photo of himself in a pocket of jacket, that was, his clothing was clean, and then he would put it away and it would remain in his wardrobe for the next, this jacket, probably about 30 years before he passed away, in situ. So to me, to leave that all in there is very much a document that he intended to put in there. But of course, he can't say yay or nay, so it's still my kind of conjecture based on my research.
Any other thoughts, questions? Just to say thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Coffee. Okay. I hope we've got most people enough. Thank you. We're in the final afternoon session with E.J. Scott, who is a senior lecturer at Central St. Martin's and the initiator and curator at the Museum of Transology. After E.J. Scott, we're going to have just a 5-minute toilet pit stop, and then we're going to get into the round room rather than... Well, we have got a round table. We are going to have I'm so happy I'm not proved a liar. Thanks, E.J.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. Thanks to the organisers. And thanks to you all for being inside here when it's a sunny Saturday out there. There are drinks afterwards, I believe, so don't fear. I would say thanks and congratulations as well to Claire Wilcox and her team for the success of the exhibition. So let's dive straight in. Culture and gender theorist Paul Preciado asserts that countersexuality's task, and we'll think about countersexuality a little bit more, is to identify the erroneous spaces, the biotextual structural flaws of the body. And so he says to think of intersex bodies, transsexuals, queens, diesel dykes, faggots, butchers, the hysterical, the horny, the frigid, the sexually disabled, the mentally ill. And to bolster the power of deviating and drifting from the heterocentric bio-writing machine. Bit of a mouthful, but we'll get there, I promise. So too, today then, my objective is to bolster the power of trans men's fashion. To quote from the V&A's exhibition page for Fashioning Masculinities, to unpick masculinity at the seams of the heterosexual bio-writing machine that is the colonial fashion archive. Let me begin by introducing you, for those of you who don't know anything about it, to the Museum of Transology. It's now the world's biggest collection of objects, material, culture relating to trans, intersex and non-binary people's lives. There's over 1,000 of the objects. Hi, sis. There's over 1,000 of the objects in the collection. There's loads, basically. It's massive. The whole premise of it is that The object is chosen by the trans person to talk about their experience, to counteract the way in which our lives and stories and narratives are spectacularised by the UK's media, by the government, and so forth. And it does this by enabling people to write their stories on the tag of the object that they get to choose, so that they are the curator of their gender stories. And so we use the archive politically by ensuring that the object is archived with the tag as two parts of one whole, so that the stories can never be written out. The beauty of the sheer size of the collection is that it reflects the diversity of the trans experience, and in particular the more often than not hidden trans masculine experience. This is something that quite often goes under the radar. We talk a lot about trans women, but really about the medically transitioned trans man. And it's important because trans masculinity is its own form of masculinity, often directly informed by being forcibly socialised as a girl in early years, which is why so many of us are angry feminists. That's why you laugh. I'm going to spare you all from exploring how outdated the school of feminism is that says that women can't be empowered by having a boob job or wearing makeup, which is why the trans community is often has laid at its feet this accusation that our community reinforces gender stereotypes and is therefore anti-feminist. Because I think that there's objects in the collection that actually can do this talking for us. This is a very small pair of pastel pink ballet shoes, standard issue for a little girl starting ballet classes. And even that art form itself is perceived to be sort of this quintessential introduction to femininity for young girls, right? The tag written by the young trans man who donated the shoes reads, "My first pair of ballet shoes," underlined for emphasis. "I've been doing ballet since I was 4 years old. When I came out, I was worried that people wouldn't see me as male because of my love of ballet and pointe. But because I love it so much, I refused to quit. Since coming out, I've been more confident in my dancing, and while they were worn long before my transition, they hold a lot of memories for me because ballet's made me the man that I am." I know many of you here today, and so I'm pretty confident in saying that I'm sure we're all comfortable in admitting that we worship at the altar of Judith Butler. To make sure, though, that we are on the same page, Butler argues that gender is a mode of becoming, that it's not biologically determined, it's not some inner truth, but rather it's the outcome of repeatedly performing gendered acts. So to quote from one of the tags written by UAL Fine Arts student Isaac, to accompany this recent acquisition of over 700 individually numbered testo-gel tubes, or in the words of Butler, over 700 tubes of repeatedly performed gender acts, I quote, "Throwing them away would have felt like throwing away years of work and discarding part of myself." Butler goes so far as to suggest that gender doesn't actually exist as an inherent natural performance of gendered behaviour. Those behaviours we term masculine and feminine. And that Western society itself associates as being a byproduct of our biological composition. Instead, they are constructed by language, by convention, and by common practice that is taught and that is learned and imposed by the need to sustain a system of signs and conventions that maintain heterosexual society. And I think it's really interesting to think about this in the context of ICOM yesterday or the day before publishing the two proposed definitions of a museum that we can vote on. Both of the definitions included the word education in them as the museum's mission, right? So the museum has a responsibility, well, we'll get up to it. So this idea that masculinity is learned is exemplified by the donation of a black cap by a young man who travelled hundreds of miles to Brighton Trans Pride a couple of years ago because he knew that the Museum of Transology would be there and that we'd have a drop-off collecting point, and he didn't trust the post, and his cap was so precious that he insisted on accompanying it and delivering it himself to ensure that it arrived safely. The tag says, "My favourite hat," and my favourite hat's written in capital letters. "As a child, I would watch my granddad with pure adoration. He is always stylishly dressed in a suit and his best church hat. He had many beautiful qualities which I admire. Best of all, he was a gentleman. He passed away before I could explain to him how much he shaped me as a person. He taught me kindness and, I'd like to think, many other great, great qualities. He's also the reason I love hats. Eve Kosoffi-Sedgwick made it clear in the 1990s that the expression, it's a boy or it's a girl, that's smacked onto our buttocks with glee when we emerge into the world, are social rituals that are, in fact, performative invocations. The I do that marries us to a gender partner for the rest of our life, through thick and thin, through sickness and in health, especially if you're trans. It's these moments that have the power to invest a body with masculinity or femininity traits. With this biology, I thee wed you to this lifelong gender partner. It's the same birth moment described by Sedgwick that's used to justify the barbaric and irreversible surgery that's still termed corrective, that's legally forged upon the intersex child's body without their consent. Every day in the UK, it's estimated that there's over 10,000 surgeries conducted on intersex babies per year in the UK. And to give you an idea of how many people are intersex, which really confuses the idea of femininity and masculinity being attached to biology, yeah? The UK Intersex Society says that there's as many intersex people as there are redheads. That's a lot. This badge says, my intersex inclusive badge is very important. Intersex people can be trans too. Sex and gender are very binary. It shouldn't be acceptable. It ruins lives. Hashtag break the binary. Conversely and hypocritically, trans teenagers, on the other hand, are deemed incapable of making decisions about their own gender development during their pubescent years, precisely the period that society understands them to be spending coming to terms with who they are and who they're going to be, right? And so it is that this week in the Queen's speech, Prince Charles declared the government's decisive action banning conversion therapy for gay and bisexual people, deliberately ensuring, and this was debated in the House of Commons, that it remains legal to inflict conversion therapy on trans people, the majority of whom will be young people. So the debates around why trans people should not be included in the ban on conversion therapy sparked protests across the UK, and with the help of volunteers all over the country, the Museum of Transology has collected over 300 signs from the rallies in London, Birmingham, Brighton, Manchester, Oxford and Glasgow. To return to Preciado's countersexual manifesto, he argues that even the sexual organs themselves are not exact biological places. They are, in his words, a technology of heterosocial dominance that reduces the living body to erogenous zones according to an asymmetrical power distribution between the feminine and masculine genders, matching certain affectations with particular organs, certain sensations or effects with particular anatomical reactions. And I'm going to spare you the way that he explores this using other parts of the body that clearly give pleasure, but that we don't put into the same category of feminine and masculine, because we all have them. Western human nature is therefore itself a product of social technology that reproduces the equation nature equals heterosexuality on our bodies, architectures and discourses. The heterosexual system is an epistemic regime and social apparatus that produces femininity and masculinity and operates by dividing and fragmenting the body. He continues that sexual roles and practices, which are naturally attributed to the masculine and feminine genders, are an arbitrary grouping of regulations inscribed onto living bodies that assure the material exploitation of one sex over the other. Sexual difference is a heteropartitioning of the body, so I argue then, by extension, as a fashion historian, that the binary of menswear and womenswear is the material manifestation of this sexual socio-technology. Additionally, the body can be unpartitioned just as effectively as it is heteronormalised through trans people's use of hormones, gender reassignment surgery, and fashion. Jack Holbersam proposes that masculinity must not and cannot and should not reduce masculinity down to the male body and its effects. And we've seen this really clearly explored in the exhibition on at the V&A at the moment. He argues that whilst we have a difficult time defining masculinity as a society, we have little trouble recognising it. And indeed, we spend massive amounts of time and money ratifying and supporting the versions of masculinity that we're allowed to enjoy and trust. And we can see how this works through an examination of this object, number 54 in the collection. The tag attached to this well-loved and chewed dinosaur plush toy reads, "This was my dog's beloved toy. My dog always accepts and loves me, just as I am. I'm his daddy, no matter how I look or feel. Playing with him makes the world okay again, even if just for a few minutes." The young lad's narrative represents the familiar, age-old, legendary bond between a man and his dog, and how this relationship underpins and strengthens the contributor's masculinized sense of self-worth. Of course, loving a pet isn't gender-specific, but the trope, man and his dog, ties to the object a well-rehearsed and rarely permissible performance of masculine sensitivity made visible. Highly emotive, it touches a nerve that lures the viewer into caring about this young trans man's well-being, despite any preconceived bias they might hold against trans people. But more than this, precisely because it embraces the legend of the bond of a man and his dog, the masculine sensitivity becomes permissible, and moreover, a sign of masculinity, rather than a sign of weakness. Trans masculinity, then, is not necessarily entirely removed from the tropes of cis masculinity. Object number 42 is this clip-on school tie with a blue, green and silver diagonal stripe, and it has this message written on the tag that accompanies it. "This is the tie that I wore on my first day living fully as a boy. I moved school to transition as my previous school taught boys and girls separately," and then in brackets he's put, "Weird, right? Question mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. This time means so much because it was like a new birthday, no longer living in the past, but having a new and more positive future. Stay strong, everyone, Max." And then there's a little self-portrait in black ink next to it of Max in his tie with a speech bubble saying, "Hi everyone, I'm Max." So cute. Whilst the tag written by its donor is about the trans experience, the design history of this staple of masculine dress reveals actually another story. At the back of the tie is a metal clip, making it what's termed a clip-on tie. You can also notice it's clip-on because, of course, there's no material around the neck that goes underneath the collar to hold it on. It floats magically like a physical metaphor of transmasculine mystique. The clip-on tie was said to be invented in the late 1920s, a period in men's dress history where the wearing of a tie was an essential piece of male dress etiquette respectability. The clip-on tie was not only this time time-saving, it could also be life-saving, because if the tie became caught, it could be tugged off before resulting in strangulation. This is the reason why today it's still standard issue for the British police, for example, and why historically you can see engineers wearing ties on building sites as a formal mode of dress that elevated their position above the construction workers without endangering them by it being caught in machinery. The mechanism of the clip-on tie means it's necessarily pre-tied, a time-saving device, but also it's a way of ensuring a handsomely regulated smartness, though no doubt it would make Beau Brummel turn in his grave. Clip-on ties are pre-tied, the knots are mass-produced and identical in their effect. The ties cannot be made longer or shorter, and again this is why you frequently see on films the comedic depiction of an incompetent man with a tie that's too short. Far from being a sign of masculine incompetence, for this young trans man, the clip-on tie represents an assuredness that his gender expression is aligned not only with his gender experience, but with the gender experience of his cisgendered male classmates. It makes his masculinity uniform. It's my contention that for the transition trans men, for the transition trans man, we're not actually able to separate out gender from the body as easily as quite often it is argued, particularly and loudly by the trans community. Now, I need to be very careful here. I'm not saying that this is the same as arguing gender and biology are distinct. I think that they absolutely are. But the body can be reshaped. So I'm increasingly toying with new ideas around the possibilities unleashed by the transitioned, refashioned trans man's body as a dually coded operative that can be used to demonstrate what I term gender orientation, that I perceive to be a natural extension of sexual orientation, that defies the idea that gender and sexuality are for everybody neat and distinct categories. The more I explore this idea with transition trans men, the more it makes sense to me. I rely on bell hooks here to justify drawing upon my personal lived experience in my professional work here today, not least because building trust in the Museum of Transology as a project amongst trans people who were either sceptical or entirely disinterested in museums because they felt they were either misrepresented in them or overlooked in them, and therefore that they lacked relevance, relied entirely upon the fact that I am trans, not the fact that I'm a trained museum curator. My ability to converse openly with trans men about the complexity of their link between their transness and what some identify as their lesbian past also relies on me sharing that experience. So this outfit that was donated, as you will know, Sean, by the award-winning filmmaker Campbell X, was collected for the surfers, soulies, skinheads and skaters subcultural style from the 40s to the 90s exhibition at the V&A prior to this guy's gender transition. It was collected specifically to evidence lesbian style and, I'd go so far as to say, lesbian masculinity. Indeed, it's transitioned in the archive, but the archive hasn't transitioned with it. So the original testimony can still be found on the website that dead names Campbell, despite a good effort being made by a V&A curator who consulted directly with Campbell about how it needs to be taken off and why it's hugely distressing to him to have his identity, his prior identity published over a decade, from over a decade ago, have it still published like this in the public domain. And it raises all sorts of questions for us. I think actually that it was probably because I know the curator and I know the work that they did with Campbell to pull it down. I think what actually it is, it's a legacy of the breadth of the taxonomy, because you can't find it when you look up the person's old name. You can't find it when you look up the exhibition. You can't find it when you look up lesbian, but when you look up belt, there it is. Right? So I think there's lots and lots and lots of questions for us to explore here. To expand our understandings of masculinity in the fashion archive, we not only have to reckon with the broader historical term of masculinity and gender at large, not as a manifestation of identity, but rather as Butler's idea of gender as a mode of becoming, but also we're going to have to reckon with the archive itself. And as Stoller makes clear, to turn, and I quote, to turn further toward a politics of knowledge that reckons with archival genres, cultures of documentation, fictions of access, and archival conventions. Just as the archive is the supreme technology of the state of the late 19th century imperial state, a repository of codified beliefs that clustered and bore witness to connections between secrecy, the law, and power, I argue so too it remains the bastion of gender binaries. Transphobia is a colonial project, and colonial archives are both transparencies on which power relations were inscribed and the sexual technologies of the rulers. It's where they're taught and where they're learned. After all, I come back to this week's definition by ICON of the museum as an educational institution. Transphobia is colonial. There's significant evidence across the globe and beyond the West that trans people are valued in their cultures, even spiritually revered because of their transness. So we only have to look at the Hijra in India, who still to this day earn their livings by performing religious ceremonies such as blessings at really important events such as christenings and weddings. You wouldn't have a christening or a wedding if you're a certain class in India without having a Hijra there, right? So, and if you'd like to know more about this, I've listed my key texts at the end of the presentation, but you need to look up Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Gender and Sex in African Society, and Boy Wives and Female Husbands, Studies in African Homosexualities. Both of these texts demonstrate the concept of binary gender heteronormativity to be a Western construct that did not exist in Africa before the colonial enforcement of a dichotomous understanding of sexual and gender difference. British colonisation colonised gender. The link between trans masculinity and spirituality that I was talking about with the Hijras is also evidenced in the MOT's own collection. The message written on this tag by a medically transitioned Jewish trans man explains his trans masculinization of his kippah as being emblematic of his entire life trajectory, inextricably linking his religious values to the formation of his gender identity. He says, "This rainbow kippah," and he's put in brackets Jewish religious headgear, "signifies the miracle of my journey." The miracle, such powerful words, of my journey. Assigned female, tomboy, secular, coming out as queer, practicing my faith, coming out as trans, transitioning, using my Hebrew name. In all this, I have queered the traditionally cis male kippah, not just by the rainbow pattern, but by making it transmasculine. The ability to reclaim our spaces, and a really good example is this terminology, reclaiming terminology, is a powerful measure of the confidence and well-being of a minority community. The way this T-shirt is hung, you can't see on the back of it that it's got emblazed across the back. So the front says "By the Power of Tea," and across the back, and I really had to think carefully about how to hang it in the Brighton Museum exhibition, because not everyone coming to Brighton Museum when the Museum of Transology was on knew that the Museum of Transology was on. They could just buy a general ticket. Whereas if you came to the Fashion Space Gallery, you probably aren't going to have a problem with transness, right? So it's a different audience. And so I was really worried about it because on the back of this T-shirt is written in really big letters, "Tranny." And we don't use that word in our community because we don't think it's safe. So it hasn't been reclaimed like the word queer, because it's still something that's used actively against our community as a slur, a violent slur. But what this T-shirt really marks for me is the fact that, here it is hanging up at the London College of Fashion. But while I'm here, I'm just going to point out one of my favourite things in the collection, the T-shirt in the middle that says, "Nice gender, did your mum pick it out for you?" The reason I say, I think the T-shirt really makes a material marker, a fashionable marker of the fact that the trans community is 50 years behind the gay and lesbian community in its struggle for equal rights. And I don't make that date up, that amount of time up. I do it by doing my fashion history research. So Catherine Hamnett, 1984, slogan T-shirts. this trend informs the birth of the slogan T-shirt. I'm sorry, I forgot that I didn't have time to relay out this slide anyway. So then we move on to the Love T-shirt with the pink triangle, early 1990s, if you ask me. I think that date actually might be a bit late. I think it might actually, in my mind, be late 80s. We then go on to the Dikey, Just Do It, 2000. And queer, You Just Can't Beat the Feeling. So we're looking at going back to around 1984, and indeed, you know, the touch point for me would be how massive and iconic the Silence Equals Death T-shirts worn by ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, that was that formed in 1987. I think we're talking about 1987. That was the height of slogan T-shirts that were at the crux of the gay liberation movement. It was then that people were going, look at me, I'm gay, because it was a political act to come out, right? We're seeing exactly the same thing in the trans community, right? Happening now. So 1984 to 2024, it's exactly, 40. So, to conclude, despite being 50 years behind the UK, in the UK, with our politics and our struggle for liberation, and sometimes, honestly, I think it feels like we're slipping backwards, not moving forwards. I have to say that discovering that trans men were included in the Fashioning Masculinities exhibition really was something that was incredibly powerful for me personally. It offered me just sort of a rare moment of hope that change was actually possible. Since 2014, when I've been collecting for the Museum of Transology, I've been banging on about the fact that if you erase people from history, then you render them historically homeless, right? You teach them that their people have never contributed anything meaningful to the world. But the fact is, if we don't separate gender and sexuality and we bring them back together, overlapping like a Venn diagram instead of being linear like a binary, right? And we go, look, all of these things happen at once and we're all a part of them, because not one single one of you is only masculine or feminine. We are all Venn diagrams, right? When I think about us being included in the exhibition, and I think about maybe the story that I've been banging on starting to change, it really plays a significant role in this recognition that actually trans people have always been there, but do you know what? We've always been at the heart of the fashion industry. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, EJ. Just one or two items for conversations. Any questions?
Yes, I have had in my career quite a number of children who've identified as non-binary more recently or have transitioned. Have you any advice for me as their teacher? Usually, I mean, the other day, for example, I had an interview and a kid came up to me at the end and thanked me, and I thought it was for the lesson. And they said, no, it was thank you for referring to me in my pronouns. And I was thought, well, why wouldn't I? Because you're a human being and you deserve respect. I don't know if that was the right answer, but that's what they said to me.
It's definitely the right answer. I mean, there's things that just need to be done to make classrooms safe and accepting, you know. Starting with pronouns at the start of a lesson is a really good one. Knowing where people can be referred to, students that are in crisis. So mermaids, you know, gendered intelligence here in London, for example, to get support. People need social support. They need to find their people. We need to include transness in the curriculum, right? So just as I'm saying that we need to decolonise gender, part of decolonising the curriculum is to include gender diverse materials within them. But whereabouts do you teach?
I currently teach at Angels College in Reading, and what's lovely is we're doing an identity fashion project at the moment.
Yeah. Well, that'll do it.
Yeah. One of my kids, and well, a little group of them within that group are identifying with pronouns they, them.
Yeah.
And one of the kids was showing me that book the other day, and it's a new series on Netflix. I can't remember what it's called. please forgive me,
No,
but they were showing me the book, and were so proud to show me this book and said, "You really like the teacher, and he reminds me of you." I thought, well, I hope that's
But it means it's important though, isn't it? So again, part of colonising the curriculum and decolonising unis at large is that we have to have better gender representation on our staff force. Students need to see people that they can recognise, understand and reflect their own experiences. So we need gender diversity in our teams as well. So I'm not a gender counsellor, and I don't have all the answers, but I can say that finding materials that are reliable from experts in the field, from organisations like Gendered Intelligence, they have a plethora of materials that are just fantastic.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for being so supportive.
I think you were next, and then you.
I know a lot of the items in your collection are items that people have donated on their own. Do you guys ever go out and actively collect things or like acquire things, or is everything donated?
So the collecting policy is something that I could talk about for hours actually, and I've done a lot of thinking about over the years. The whole premise is that you are the curator of your own gender story, right? I've got a neat t-shirt that says "Curate Your Gender." The idea is that everyone can contribute an object. It's not up to me to decide what goes in it. That way we deconstruct the hierarchy of importance, right? That every single object will also go on display, meaning that everyone's story is important as everyone else's, which means that we help fight this idea that trans people are talked over and on top of instead of spoken to, that age-old sort of that catchphrase, "Nothing about us without us." However, I do proactive collecting for things that I think are really important. So, for example, the Black Trans Lives Matter exhibition, I was concerned myself with. I've always collected proactively from the Black and Brown trans communities, but it's harder, obviously, because they're not interested in colonial museological collection projects by and large, right? So I've gone out to those communities, and when I've got objects, and I've got them back and they've written their story on the tags, I realised when I looked across and sort of did an overview of the tags that none of the tags that I know come from Black and Brown people mentioned race. So they were singular narratives, not intersectional narratives, and there's a really clear reason why that would be. The tags aren't big enough, right? But it's about decolonising my own curatorial practice. Not one curatorial approach is going to work for all communities, right? Some people need more spaces. And so I went out and over COVID created online Zoom interviews with people from the community, holding up their objects, talking about them, and recording a bigger story about them, why and how gender and race intersect. So that's one example. But we also went to the Black Trans Lives Matter protest and saved 195 of the protest signs from that. And we've just proactively collected more than 300 signs from the banned trans conversion therapy. We're having our 10-year anniversary exhibition in 2024 at Central St Martin's Letherby Gallery, and I'm going to proactively collect from the 13 trans pride organisations around the UK as well to expand the narrative. It's not really the Museum of Transology, it's the Museum of the Privilege to be Trans in the South East Transology Museum, right? So I really want to sort of broaden the conversation as well. But I'm trying not to put my curatorial narrative in it. It's not perfect, and I can't say that it's not there, but I try as hard as I can not to make this a collection about me, even though Jean Baudrillard says that the beauty of collecting is that we collect ourselves.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, it was on a similar note actually, though. You mentioned that there was like a donation point for that during Brighton Trans Pride. I just wanted to know more about that. Like, how many did you get? How did you sort those?
Yeah, so it's really important, I think, when museums have neglected communities, I think it's really, really passive-aggressive to call us hard to reach. We have hardly been reached out to, right? And so just because everyone's like, oh, now we want to make museum's diverse. Yeah, be inclusive. Come to our museum. Do some community co-curation. Yeah, do you know what? I don't need to do your labour for you. You come to me, right? And so I'm intent on not asking trans people to come to museums before they're safe and they see themselves represented there. I take the museum to them and their spaces and meet them on their terms. And so in the Queer Britain, the LGBT museums just opened up the first bricks and mortar queer museum in the UK in Granary Square, in their first exhibition that's going to open, the temporary exhibition of photography up at the moment, but in their first exhibition proper that's going to open, we're putting in there the first case that I used to take around in a massive flight case and unpack and put up in pubs with fairy lights. And we're going to put that actual case as the history of the Museum of Transology in the exhibition, because that's what made it work, going into those spaces. And I started with, a table and a second-hand Art Deco cabinet that cost £10 and only had $1 left on it. Right, and eventually saved up my money and got an actual case, a flight case, and eventually built up until there was a sizable enough collection that had commanded enough attention that people wanted to use the objects and put them on in their museums to rob me of my cultural capital.
Can I say one nice thing based on your talk? And you talked about representation. So what was lovely the other day was on Thursday, I was having a coffee after work and I walked past the table and there's a little art group that meets on a Thursday outside my room, and my colleague runs it, and I noticed that they had all these rainbow stickers with things on them and they were painting trans flags and different representations and stuff. And I went over to the table and said, "Oh, this looks nice, I like your stickers." And one of the little boys, he's only year 7, he was like, "Oh, I'm Miss Brady, I'm gay." And I was like, "Oh, that's nice, don't worry about it," and stuff. And then two of the other kids that were there just turned around to me, because they're only 11, and they were like, "Oh, we identify as trans." And I was like, "Great, brilliant."
Yeah.
And it was just, I just said to them, it was very different when I was at school, very different. And I said, "I'm so happy that you're happy and that you feel comfortable to tell me that." And I just said, "Thank you for sharing your story." So there are good things.
Sounds like I get pushed into trans conversion therapy. Yeah.
No, but it was just nice that they...
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's wonderful. And 2014 is largely touted as being the trans tipping point. This is when there was an explosion in trans visibility in the media, and the backlash quickly ensued. One of the strongest narratives in the backlash is that it's a phrase. The kids will grow out of it. They'll all want to do transition. So we're clearly seeing that this is not going away. And as archivists and people that work in the fashion industry, we really need to catch up with how we're going to archive objects that transition in the archive as not simply out of respect, but as with a commitment to understanding the social agency that museums have. If the museum is saying there are only binary fashion in the archive, and we can't even for the very, 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 very rare objects that we have, we can't even archive it correctly or safely, what are we teaching? What are we using fashion to teach? And yet fashion has always, trans people and genderqueer people have been at the heart of fashion forever. It's our archive. Yeah. So I think yeah. I've been about that for ages.
Okay. Thank you, EJ. Have a sip. Join the crowd. And then I think we're there.
Hi, Charlie.
So have we got everybody
I was
here?
waiting for Cyan.
I'm here.
You're there. Right in front of you.
So I'll come here, that would be great.
Now, this, again, I'm not going to speak very long. This is a round table that I really asked Jay and Charlie from the LCF Masculinities Hub to pull together and to help us round up, maybe corral some of the ideas that have been brought forward in today's discussion, and maybe blow a few things apart as well. Who knows? We're about to find out. This can be, say, 50, 55 minutes. If you overrun a little bit, no one's going to yell at us. Just to highlight, as Ida was mentioning also, thanks very much to the Masculinities Hub. We do have a few drinkies and crispies and nibbles in the refectory canteen area when we're finished. Once the round table has concluded, I'm just going to do a 5-minute roundup, and it'll literally be free association, consciousness of ideas, thoughts, words that have come to light in my mind, that have sort of sparked an interest for me during the day. Okay? Charlie,
Right,
Jay, take it away.
Well, hi everybody. So we're very happy to be here, and just to say that we are from the Cultural and Historical Studies Department now, I think it's called, isn't it? At LCF, and we are the co-conveners of the Masculinities Hub that holds events every year. And we inherited that from Sean here, who was at one time the before he left. So
welcome
back, Sean, on lots of levels. So I'd like to, and just to say that we're going to sort of start the conversation going. We'd be really very happy for people to ask questions and perhaps to just comment as well on the themes raised. And I wanted to start actually there with you, EJ, and to go back to the points that you made about decolonizing archiving and also exhibitions generally, the exhibition space, all of that. So the importance of that on many levels. I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit more, and also to consider how you put that into practice in relation to your own teaching at St. Martin's on your course. And the kind of demands, I think we spoke one time and you were saying that it was something that the students were keenly aware of.
Oh, they demanded.
Exactly. So it was really that side and that about that, and then to ask other people maybe to contribute about, you know, in relation to their own teaching, those of us who do it. Well, not us, but those of you who do it. So
I think we can start with the premise that we talk about this idea of decolonizing the museum, right? That's like saying we're going to take God out of the Catholic Church. You know, like they're colonial projects. And the education that has spun out of them holds those same values, practices. It's embedded within the institution. So we can't challenge these systems without being proactive about it. So it was a bit about what I was talking about before. This is very practical steps. You must expand the curriculum to be beyond the global north. You must have lecturers on your team whose expertise is beyond the global north, right? In the same way that we need gender diversity on our teams and in our curriculum as well, right? These things will not happen with good intentions. There is also a process that we have to go through by engaging with educating ourselves. So as curators and as academics, we must proactively read texts that expand our knowledges. You know, I am racist. That's it, full stop. I am racist because I have been colonized and I am white. This is my privileged background. I have to unlearn things I think I knew to be true, right? Because they're very, very easily challenged. And when it comes to fashion, the idea that we've created binary fashion systems here is a product of Christianity, right? You know, that's where these ideas of binary gender and the British Empire colonizing gender around the world has also colonized fashion. But we've seen how our industries have done that as well. How even the second-hand industry is killing the local production of textiles, right? Across Africa, right? Because the trade of them is so bulky and the desire and that for them that is attached to this notion of Western superiority that has been ingrained in multiple generations culturally.
Yeah.
Right. The offset of that is that we are losing techniques. Traditional is a poor word, even that is colonized. But we are losing these techniques that have been practiced for multiple generations in these communities. Specifically because of our selling of secondhand clothes over there, which as much as anything is use of disposable, a way of disposing our fast produced fashion over here, right? So I think, how does this tie in to our theme of masculinity? Well, it's about these binary gender systems, right? And these systems of production that are built economically to support these ideas of Western capital gain.
Sure. And you, in relation to representation of sex and gender, let's call it at this moment, how are you approaching that with the same view in mind, about sort of, as it were, challenging those kind of orthodoxies or those assumptions that sort of part of the colonial project, if you're seeing it as kind of a metaphor in the same way, sort of analogy rather, not metaphor, analogy. So how is that happening at St. Martin's?
We teach it.
Yeah.
We literally set texts and we get in guest speakers who are experts on it, and we teach it and we debate it and we learn it, and we bring in objects from the archive to explore it using material culture. That's my practice.
And you experience this, is there a student demand for that as well as
if we don't do it, the students will kick off. They are thirsting for it in the same way as they're thirsting for queer studies, and the same way that they're thirsting for gender diverse studies. They're thirsting for it because the majority of them are young, and these are their values. This is what they want to become academically informed about, right?
Before we move on to the next question, I'm just conscious notions of inclusivity, although that's perhaps a bit of a weak word, I'm sure have inflected on various of your practices around this round table. So does anyone want to comment on, thinking about how your collecting and your curating has spoken to issues around marginalised communities, class, of gender, class, ethnicity, racialised identity, etc.
It was interesting. I followed EJ's Museum of Transology quite a lot, and it's interesting thinking back. Certainly, when you showed those pictures of the T-shirts, and thinking back to, when I first became a curator and I first had the opportunity to do an exhibition which pushed at some boundaries and caused some sort of, which was an exhibition, Graphic Responses to AIDS, I did in the mid-90s, and how that was a bit of a challenge to push through, and then, writing the argument to get, again, it was very interesting seeing Campbell X's outfit from Street Style, the challenge we had to even get a lesbian and gay, and it was lesbian and gay at that point in time, around the same time, into Street Style exhibition, that now, I know that it's never finished, is it? But, I'm encouraged that even if our institutions and our hierarchies of our institutions are saying, do we really want to be teaching this stuff? It's really refreshing to hear that, and I don't, perhaps, I guess the makeup of the students you have often call for things in different ways, and the courses we teach. But I think it's, it's great to hear that there is that, certainly from your perspective, from what you were saying about CSM students, demanding for that kind of breadth of kind of conversation and discussion and inclusion. And, I guess, if we're sitting here, if you do another one of these, in 10 years' time, it'll be really interesting to see what the conversation was and how much things have moved on, and what we're then talking about in relation to
what the makeup of the panel is.
Intersectionality. Absolutely. And, Ben did kind of discuss that at the beginning of the morning. And I think it is interesting that, there are certain representations here, and, it will change. I don't know if I've really answered what you just said, Jay. But...
Well, even the fact that the Westminster Archive has a lot of workwear and militaria in it
is significant, isn't it? It means that you're presenting a history that's maybe a little bit different from a collection that's more reliant on, or that's more interested in beautifully handmade elite garments.
Yeah, I think that's important to us, particularly in terms of menswear, because there are so many issues around fashion and menswear. So when I talked about Massimo Osti, he didn't consider himself to be a fashion designer. The current designer for CP Company, Paul Harvey, explicitly said he was not a fashion designer. There's a lot of denial of fashion in the history of menswear, so that story really needs to be told. And there are particular areas in menswear, and I think the technical kind of garments and labels like CP Company really epitomise that, where there are these collectors and men who are very interested in these garments but do not consider themselves to be part of the fashion industry, the part of fashion. It's kind of in this other space. But the collection as a whole, although we have designer pieces and uniform and workwear, that is one of the things that we're trying to do, is to say the little trainers we bought are as important as the McQueen. It's a continuum.
And how
to have that representation.
How do they define themselves? We're talking about self-definition here today a lot. Those Osti, for example, how does he define himself?
Sorry.
How does he define himself as not as a fashion designer?
Well, he talked about things like designing continuity garments. He was interested in that replication.
So he's a designer, but just not a fashion designer.
He called himself an engineer of cloth-based objects.
Wow.
And let's unpick it though. Why doesn't he want to call himself a fashion designer?
Yeah.
Well, because of the
that it's effeminate. That it's so it's basically homophobic. Or gender non-conforming.
But it is an interesting work, when I've been doing call-outs for various research projects I've done, that are based on men, and particularly on gay men, I avoid using the word fashion because people say either I'm not interested in fashion or it attracts a certain type of person because of that loaded term, so it is still a very gendered, loaded term. I know, we do talk about men's fashion, but it is still... we're talking a lot about menswear, aren't we, rather than men's fashion, and they are distinct. But I think it's still such a loaded word, as you say, isn't it? That fashion, and the fact that we have to say men's fashion when we say fashion, we mean women's fashion.
Well, this is it. I think that we're living in a bubble.
To be binary again, forgive me.
Don't worry, I'm used to it.
Wouldn't you say we're in a bubble, but we're also at the forefront? The two that you mentioned there, Daniel, with just the fact, two things. One was the architects who, obviously are quite sophisticated people who, I imagine, who absolutely determined to put in, the red woman. Because they couldn't sort of understand
make
fashion.
everything fuchsia.
Well, she was not only a woman, but she was a red woman in the red dress and an evening dress. That was done. So it was even at that level. And then you said also with management at a certain top level who didn't seem as engaged with it as they perhaps could be, given the fact that it's...
have you seen what they wear, some of the people at the top of management? Even the fashion stuff.
Watch out, Jay, watch out. Watch out.
How can you have any credibility? But moving on. Moving on before I get my people. Clearly there's been, this moment, the exhibition, the Westminster exhibition, the Victoria and Albert exhibition, the Manchester Art Gallery exhibition that we're all hotly anticipating, sort of marks this moment of interest in dress associated with masculinities, menswear, men's fashion, and those kinds of terms. Although, as you rightly pointed out, Alistair, the dress of boys seems to be kind of excluded from that, and that is very, very interesting, since this is clearly a sort of moment in which...
I don't have any clear idea why that is, but very often things that are related to childhood seem to be relegated. That's a very general point. But even if you take something as brutal as the antiques trade, if it's related to childhood experience, it's often less valuable. I mean, that's a silly example, but you see what I'm saying? It seems to extend outwards. And I find it actually quite puzzling, because certainly for me, as you would have heard from my talk this morning, my childhood is sort of very, very important to me, and I like looking back at it. So why is it that a lot of adults actually don't want to reflect on childhood and childhood experience? And we can't possibly answer that, but it's an interesting question for me.
I wonder if there's something in it too, when you think about specifically like boys wear, we'll say, that for so long there wasn't, and speaking again from kind of a Western sphere, but there wasn't a huge differentiation between children's clothing in terms of gender.
Yeah.
And then obviously what you were speaking about today is quite like the little man. So I wonder if there's something about children's wear, especially historical children's wear, that troubles gender in a way that's not easy to define. So it's kind of like, well, you know.
Maybe that's true. I think that's interesting. And I think also it doesn't, because generally children of a certain age, although this is changing, they don't demand to be given certain kinds of clothes. In the past, it's been very much that they were dressed by an adult who decided. So that's all the whole thing about making choices in order to express yourself. That's not been part of the historical picture of childhood. And also clothes used as part of a strategy of attraction and desire. We can't, that's not the world of childhood either. So it's not being consciously explored, is it, in the same way? It's a very passive thing.
But I think that's quite recent, that idea of choice, and maybe the people who are actually in charge still of making those decisions are older people who really weren't given that choice. So for them, they were simply, the clothing was imposed on them, or it was given to them. And that might change
it could
in 30 or 40, 30 years' time, whatever, and younger people who now are more used to that.
Making their own choices.
Yeah, at a much earlier age.
At an earlier point, yeah.
I just want to say, and listening to what everybody's saying, it's quite interesting, because when I've met some people with their newborns, they don't necessarily conform in recent years to a particular colour for their child's, what the child is wearing, and it's quite interesting, because if you look at 2,000 years ago, even through Egyptology, like for example, if you go to the British Museum, the sarcophagi which are displayed, the pink ones are for the males, and the blue ones are for the females. And there was this whole discrepancy about the Tutankhamun headdress, you know, the gold with the inlay of lapis lazuli, because they reckoned it was actually for Nefertiti, because the blue of the royalty represented a female person rather than a male at that time.
Can we come back to that
Sorry.
at the end? Because I think there are some really interesting things there that we should touch on. I mean, EJ was talking today about Butler and about the kind of the notion of gender as socially and culturally constructed, which is widely accepted in the academy. It's something that maybe seems so obvious to us that we hardly need to say it. But in fact, when it comes to talking about masculinities specifically, and you were talking about the fact that trans men and trans masculinity had been kind of excluded from media representation, from representation more generally, I think there's something about a turn towards interrogating masculinity and the ways in which it's culturally constructed and reproduced culturally that is part of this current curatorial interest of which this symposium is a part. Sorry, that's a very long question. So, would anyone like to talk on that, to give us, I mean, everyone here?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, I remember, EJ talking about using Butler, and I remember the first time I came across Butler, which was doing street style. It's sort of like, what the hell is performativity? And I think that it's taken time for those concepts to trickle down, through academy and widely across academy. And it's not an easy concept. I've had conversations where I've tried to explain this to people, and who aren't in academy, and teaching it to students as well, but people outside that where they're not open to learn, it's harder. And I think it makes it complicated to then put it into something like, I'm not saying we shouldn't put it into museum exhibitions, but when you've got a 50-word label.
Yeah, how do you do that?
Well, you do it through the objects that you put on display, is how you do it. You use collections and you make sure that the collection represents more than a singular modum operandum, right? I mean, I think it's really important to think, again, back to the social agency that museums have. More men in this country die by their own hand than every form of cancer combined. So toxic masculinity isn't working for men either, right? What contribution can we make to these conversations about better understanding the impact that this masculinity is having on men's lives? Not only women's lives, and lives that go beyond the binary. I just think that these are spaces of learning, Our collections are meant to unlock a way of living in the world better. And one of the most pressing issues in contemporary society, in this country anyway, is masculinity, toxic masculinity. It's hurting men. This is really serious. We don't talk, you only have to be in the classroom post-COVID to see what dire straits so many of the young men are in. There's young men in my classroom that are barely holding on. And I think as educators and curators that we have a responsibility to serve and to listen to their needs.
And to help them to speak and articulate.
100%.
That
That's
is
what
the
museums
hardest
should
task.
do. 100%.
Because men have traditionally not been very good at accessing forms of language in terms of their personal, the most personal things. I mean, I'm sure we can all talk about our families, in regard to that. But, my father, I know everything about what my mother liked to eat, what she liked to listen to, where she liked to travel. I know almost nothing about any of those simple things with regard to my father, because he wouldn't speak about his desire.
And again, this is a learned way of being, right?
Yes.
These are learned behaviours.
Yes, from his father and so on and so forth, transmitted.
Which again, and I hate to victimize you, Alistair, but it's like, that's why it's something like a tiny little uniform, so that the idea that going off to war is the ultimate masculine goal is so
absolutely,
it's such a it's something that you would think would be such a good, if you're going to have one object in a display talking about toxic masculinity, like what's more kind of disturbing than that? But yeah, I don't know, I guess I just really want to see an exhibition of boys' clothes.
100%. But I mean, how important, how incredibly important.
But I think it also raises the question of, we're moving so fast with ideas, but I think talking about naming, personally, I have a problem in terms of vocabulary and terms. I don't really know what masculinity actually means, what people mean by that myself. When people use it, especially as an adjective, masculine, they talk about clothes being masculine. I know what I think they mean, but what they think it's not. But it's not something or other, but it's not actually that clear.
Jack Halberstam talks about it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But even calling it female masculinity, and Famous 98 and brought that out. Is it?
But it's the same thing, isn't it? It emerges out of a silence, and it emerges out of it only gets described by what exists around it that you push against. It doesn't exist in it as a spoken.
Exactly. But I think he had to call it that because there was no way of understanding or breaking it down unless you actually use those two words together.
I mean,
female masculine, I think, was essential to do.
It's old-fashioned and obvious to, it's maybe not old-fashioned, but it's obvious to go to Connell's model of hegemonic masculinity, but I think it's still the most useful schema. I mean, in the media, people talk about toxic masculinity because people understand what that means. It comes from the kind of mythopoetic men's movement, and I think for me, I have some difficulties with that. But Connell's notion that you have sort of marginalized and subordinated forms of masculinities, that you have kind of complicit forms of masculinity, and you have an culturally idealized form of male gender expression, which she calls dominant or hegemonic masculinity, is a really helpful framework to use. But we should.
No, yes, we should move on perhaps. And EJ, I wanted to ask you, and actually everybody else, because this is relevant, I think, to Ariana's work, but also definitely Alistair's. And that was, you said, we talked about, you actually mentioned it, the conundrum, Ben. You said and you mentioned about not projecting yourself into your personal position, into the actual exhibition itself, into curating. Am I right in thinking that? You said about keeping...
Yeah, but I don't know if I'm successful at it. I don't know if it's possible, but certainly, they're trying to understand that there's... we need to give more space to people who are being represented to speak for themselves.
Okay, so sort of segueing into that, just thinking about how important the personal is in your work, Alistair, it seemed to me that when you were talking about, especially with Mishima, when he was referring to seeing that boy coming towards it, and then so like almost like a sort of Bart's idea of the punctum. It's like he was sort of hit by seeing the trousers, and it's sort of and it seemed that your actual process of collecting is a bit like a punctum. When you see something, you're sort of driven to obtain it, to acquire it, like that. And I thought that was really fascinating. And in your work, thinking about that sort of personal side, but the sensory side, which is always personal. So how can it not be? And the multisensorial aspect. I mean, all that amazing software that you can turn things around and do all that stuff. And that was all incredible. But I thought that was very fascinating. And I thought that in terms of people who've had experience in exhibition work, is this an area that's being taken more seriously? That sensory element and the emotive element rather than the intellectual element, just the intellectual.
I think making them discrete is probably the issue, because I think the sensory is not necessarily non-intellectual.
No.
But
it's not, but focusing on it, because even when it's included, and there's always a sensory element in every exhibition.
It's like rub this, or
but actually, or rather, but actually
whatever masculinity.
It's somehow not that respectable to actually focus on that. It's more think about that, and if you want to rub it, then do or don't, or smell it or sniff. And I thought that was fascinating. Did you go around spraying it? Just keeping it
No, it was like a very elaborate rig with like a Muji scent stone and all this kind of stuff. I can tell you like all the like non-glamorous things I did.
I love that. I thought that was really interesting.
I think this ties into... Oh God, let me see if I can try to make a coherent thought out of this. Sensory engagement in exhibition work, if you were doing that as a curator, we'll just say curator, is highly individual. But like I kind of said it in my presentation, all curatorial work is highly subjective, highly biased, and that word's scary for a lot of people because they take it as like a negative, but we are humans, we use cognition, we have bias, it's inbuilt into who we are. But because the museum, if we're talking about the museum, is an institution of veracity, what the museum says is the truth. And that's been the kind of generally held belief in the colonial museum.
She's being questioned.
And the curator is seen as the arbiter of that truth to the public. But actually, we're not neutral. We're not objective. I'm sorry.
No.
And so I think in using sensory more sensorial techniques in exhibiting, it's maybe being a little bit more transparent and putting the curator more explicitly in the exhibition, which I think people have been really like, it's not about the curator, it's about this concept. And it's like, well, no, it didn't just materialize in a case. You know, somebody selected it for certain reasons and wrote a label for certain reasons and displayed it for, you know. So, I don't know, did I answer?
Yeah,
did I say anything?
An aspect of it. I mean, it was, you know, it's about certain exhibitions that do encourage that kind of connection that perhaps is seen by some people as being less masculine, I don't know. And certain things that are certain exhibitions that are more, Mark talked about being an anorak, sort of the idea of the sort of more
obsessive,
detailed focus.
Yes.
Detailed focus, which I think is not incompatible with an emotional attachment at all, because it's actually very emotional, but it's kind of giving voice to it. So when you actually have those kind of sensory kind of experiences in exhibitions, I think it actually kind of adds, I think it's really sort of, for me, very impactful. I really like that. I just wondered what the audience thought about that, or how they might feel about that, where they can ask questions, I suppose.
Yeah. Could we, I mean, I'm sure you guys have got thoughts about objectivity and subjectivity in your work that you might like to elaborate on, but also about exhibition design. So the Westminster show, for instance, were in this kind of sepulchral space.
You love
sort of industrial. It was industrial.
Concrete bunker.
Yeah.
Very large concrete bunker underneath Marylebone. Our building in Marylebone. Yes, so we responded to that space. Very much so. And it was filthy.
I didn't notice. Was it?
I scrubbed the floor. I scrubbed the stairs myself.
Okay, right.
So, I mean, it didn't meet any museum standards for exhibitions. It was dirty. It was light levels were wrong. The garments, you could tell you.
Good.
But that's what really sort of added it, because it was this quite brutalist kind of interior.
Yeah, so the University of Westminster taught civil engineering until somebody decided to close the course. So underneath our building in Marylebone, we have this concrete bunker. It was like double width, where they tested concrete. They built buildings, like whole houses and things like that. And it was used for storage.
In that space?
In that space.
Amazing.
And
It's
it
like
was
a
used
forest.
for storage for many years, and then somebody in architecture thought, this is ridiculous, we should use it for something, for exhibitions and various things. But it's a problematic history within the University of Westminster, unsurprisingly, yes. But it's a very industrial space. It's made of concrete. It's had very little interventions in it since, and that's been a deliberate choice, or money, but also a deliberate choice, I think, as well. So we are very lucky to have it, and because we knew that that's where our exhibition was going to be, we responded to that space.
And quite sympathetic too.
Yeah, well, it worked with our collection.
Yeah, right.
It really did.
And of course, access is problematic as well, but we made a decision to use our street access, which means it goes through a car park, past the rubbish bins, all of those kinds of things to get to the space.
Yeah, that's quite sensory.
Smell that.
I don't know what your policy was on touching things. I
Smells
did
like
touch them.
workwear.
Was that all?
We weren't supposed to.
You weren't supposed to.
But ironically, given the size of the space, we actually kind of ran out of room. Like, we were struggling to fit everything in that we wanted to. So I would have preferred to have more, like our plinths to be bigger, but we couldn't fit
It's like a sort of conifer forest of clothing. It was amazing.
Yeah, again, we were thinking about armies, regiments. And very much so, we deliberately decided to have all of the mannequins at the same height, and to mix up the military uniform, the technical garments with designer garments, to put them all on the same level, to sort of not have this hierarchy, which fashion so often does. I mean, of course, there always is a hierarchy, and we were making personal decisions about what to include and not to include. But
I'm quite specific about my workwear.
And do you want to talk about the way that you designed the Manchester show?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me to be an external curator as opposed to years of being an internal curator for the V&A. You know, I was there for many years, and you know, in my last jobs, the kind of the contemporary program that I was part of had a kind of way of curating where we were project managers and curators and events organisers and all of this kind of thing. So, you know, to have this role where I come in as the sort of, you know, Chris Brewer talks about it, doesn't he? As the kind of the expert sort of swanning in and saying, I want this, you know, will be quite easy to do. But, you know, it's interesting then working with two other curators who are part of the institution of which I'm employed to do this project, and the decision making that comes. You know, we spent quite a lot of time rethinking the way the exhibition would be designed, because we had, I think, I'm trying to remember what the chronology was now. I think we had 2 spaces, then we had 3 spaces, then we had different spaces. Then there were all sorts of curatorial conservation issues that I don't know whether I'm allowed to say, but you can make guesses at what that was, which put, you know, delay. So, you know, and then this idea that the 2 galleries that we've got, which are on top of each other, which is a challenge for an exhibition in and of itself. One of those was going to be the new permanent fashion gallery. And this was the first exhibition. So we were then constrained, if you like. Well, on one hand, we were constrained by a design. On the other hand, we got, because we were the first gallery in it, we had the option to design what we would do. The fact that we're borrowing and the fact that we have historic warm garments do mean that there are regulations that you didn't have to bound by. So, you know, in some ways, the design and the arrangement of our objects has been determined by the size of, which it always is. I mean, this, you know, this is nothing unusual to anyone who's curating. But the particularities of that space and the particularities of the movement and, you know, how we do it has meant that we've made certain decisions, and things that we were sure we were going to have in the exhibition aren't making it, because now there isn't the space to have this many things. And what stories do we want to tell? What kind of comparisons do we want to make? What kind of aspects of men's fashion? And this is, I have to say, I'm quite pleased we don't have that. I know an exhibition about men's fashion will inevitably talk about issues of masculinity and masculinities, but I'm very glad we didn't put it in our title because you're opening up to so many critiques. Not that Dandy doesn't open you up to all sorts of critiques. It does as well, doesn't it? Yeah. You know, and I talked about that earlier. But I think, you know, the space is determines so much about what you can do and what you can't do. And, you know, the fact that you have to come up through this, you know, colonial imperialist civic building, you know, to come to this exhibition and then go through it again, you know, already has conversations. It were the conversations we had when we did the Black British Style exhibition at the V&A about, you know, who wants to walk through those doors, and back to, you know, EJ's points about people not feeling they are represented and not necessarily wanted to come to it. So all those kind of considerations, and how you then, even as you start to go outside the exhibition, we were having a discussion the other day about what images do we have on the banners outside the exhibition. You know, one, to how do you represent 250 years of British men's fashion, which is, you know, not the exhibition subtitle, but it's effectively what it is, and to then have discussions about more inclusive. And interestingly, we were talking about the Lubena Himid image as a possible. And someone, when I was there from a different team, came in and said, we were using that image recently out at a sort of local community event at Platt Hall, and people hated it because it seemed to be a colonializing image, but it was put in juxtaposition with one of the early 19th century, portraits. So there was something to be said about that. But Lubena created it with a very particular inclusive kind of perspective when she thought about what was meant by the dance. So it's a really tricky, and all of these things. And I guess one of the reasons why it feels relevant to me is I was out of curating for many years. I left the V&A 15 or something years ago and stopped curating because I'd done it all my life and wanted to do something different. And, it's interesting coming back to it and thinking about what it means in those debates for someone who was in it and is now out of it, and all those conversations and discussions that we make, not just about curating, never mind about the subject of what you are curating.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if that answered your question, Jay, necessarily, but
it's a nice answer. I've just got. Can I have one
more?
Can I have one final, please, Charlie?
Yes, one more.
I've been very good all day.
You have. You put the biscuits out. You were excellent.
Okay. Well, I just had this interest in the contrast between functionality and decoration, which is a really fun way of organising or useful way of organising collections, but also a set of taxonomies that are themselves quite slippery. Because, on those garments, which are kind of obviously miniaturised versions of uniforms that had functions, even if an epaulette or a bit of gold lace didn't serve a practical function, it served the function of identifying someone's rank or their relationship within a hierarchy. So that is a function in and of itself. And it made me think of when I worked at Margaret Howell, and they have a diffusion line. I worked in the shop, and they had a diffusion line that was called MHL, the tagline of which was inspired by functionality, which I always found really weird. What does that mean? What is inspired by functionality? And yet there are lots of things that are inspired by functionality, like the Burberry, that fabulous high-vis Burberry jacket, which is amazing.
But even on a really basic level in terms of pockets,
Yeah.
the constant thing with women's wear not having pockets.
Yeah.
And menswear where there are pockets, many pockets, which
aren't functional.
Well, are they functional? Some of them are deliberately designed so they are functional. There's a Swiss Army uniform which was designed where every pocket has a purpose so that the men wearing it don't have to carry anything else because they carry everything on their body.
Yeah.
That has inspired designers to use those pockets and add those pockets.
And shooting coats of the early 19th century. So a lot of extra pockets.
So So on one level, those pockets, if you were looking at it from a sort of decoration, they're not decoration, but actually they are. So
but decoration is a function.
Yeah, and
that's what it is. Those are meant to impress.
Is the MA1 bomber jacket where you have the pen pockets on the sleeve, and designer versions of that or high street versions of that. Sometimes those pockets,
but no.
Or they don't work, or there isn't actually anything there. But you need that for it to be identified as a bomber jacket. But that's decoration, but you wouldn't see it as decoration.
Alistair, you.
No, I think in those shooting jackets, you read journals of the time, and they do specify, what went in every single pocket, and they've got these massive pockets inside where you put the dead animals that you've shot.
Yeah, we have some of those. Not those old ones, but
hopefully the animals have been removed.
Can I put in there something to share, which you may or may not have thought about, to do with uniforms and functionality? I've noticed through history that leaders of armies oftentimes dress down. They don't need to dress up. Zelensky is just the same thing. He's busy fighting for his life. He hasn't got the luxury of the day we're enjoying today. Let us think about them poor things. There he is in his green fatigue T-shirt. Everybody knows who he is, and that is iconic. It's iconic as Henry V at Agincourt. It's the same thing. Frederick the Great dressed plain, Peter the Great dressed plain, Charles XII of Sweden dressed plain, Napoleon, Lord Wellington, Duke of Wellington, even Churchill, the siren suit. These are signifiers. They're so important. They don't need that stuff, really. So it's everyone else.
They're also not fighting, so they don't need the pockets. Like
well, they were fighting.
Well,
No, I got this guy on the challenge. All the men I mentioned, they were all warriors. They all fought. They weren't armchair generals. It's too easy to laugh at them. You shouldn't do that.
I stand corrected.
I was going to say to you, I had a conversation with people in Liberty one day a few years ago when they were showcasing young designers like Richard Quinn and people like that, and I had a conversation with them, and it was really interesting about the functionality and all of that, and they claimed that their claim was the reason that most designers of women's wear, or what's classified as women's wear, don't have functional pockets is because you wouldn't have the sale of handbags to keep all their bits and pieces in. When you talked about functionality and all of that, and also in terms of the commercial aspect of it, if you have a pocket and it costs money and time, and each pocket that you perceive to have in your design will add incremental amounts of money to the finished product. So basically, each thing you embellish on the surface of something will incur a larger cost. But then that leads into the idea of, the ethics of fashion and how over time, you can go to Primark and buy something that looks relatively okay, but it's made at a fraction of the cost and all of that. So there's lots to think about based on what you're all saying.
True. So I think we should, I was going to say yes, and it's incredibly annoying for those of us who actually buy women's trousers that you find, I don't like the word functionality, I use the word practicality. You don't actually have pockets, especially with Zara. Really, really annoying. You like the shape, you like the cut. So irritating. So, of course, you need a bag, clearly. That's all right. But, okay, so I'd like to open this up to any questions at all or comments that people might have about themes raised today. So, you say, yeah.
I was wondering about curation, exhibitions and audiences, I guess, in terms of maybe Sean's upcoming. I went to the V&A and I've only been once. Maybe 90% of the audience was women. So I was thinking, is this really addressing that audience? Should it be speaking to a male audience, or who should it be speaking to? And are you thinking about that when you're designing your exhibitions?
I mean, I'd like to hope that men would come to our exhibition, as it is. But I remember being told when years ago I did with someone who's now a curating superstar elsewhere.
Curating superstars.
Yeah, not mention it. I'm sure they'll be happy to be named.
Andrew Bolton.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Right.
We approached the V. We were in the V&A. We suggested an exhibition on menswear, and we were told men aren't interested in coming to exhibitions. They won't come to the exhibition. So it never happened. So it's interesting to hear from you now that. And I'm trying to remember when I went how many men were in there, and I think there was a fairly good balance of men and women, if I can, be in the exhibition. So, I mean, I guess you hope that your exhibition will bring a diverse audience and that you curate something that appeals to a diverse audience. And sometimes, you don't quite get it right, and there might be something, I don't know, that isn't. Not sure what I'm trying to say now. Of course, you inevitably have to think about your audience as you curate and as you design your exhibition. You think about it, but I think we're very conscious that it's a regional museum as well. I think that's something, and I think sometimes that could be seen as a disadvantage, but I think it's to an advantage in many ways that there is a kind of a regional audience that might bring more men as a kind of a city which, you know, and a region which has a kind of histories of different forms of fashionability. I'm trying to think about the right way to say this.
And of making. I mean, we found that when we did the art of tailoring exhibition at Leeds City Gallery, we made different.
Leeds.
It was in the City Gallery, and that meant we had to make quite different curatorial decisions as we would have if we'd done it in Armley Mills, for example. So that we included women's wear, which wasn't originally, because that was the way we could sell it as being. But we did get men coming because it included men's tailoring and it included stuff about the history of menswear within Leeds, which was incredibly important for the 19th century, the 20th century.
Speaking to your local.
And I will always cherish the memory of being in that exhibition and seeing a group of young guys, teenagers come in. They didn't stay that long, but they did look at some of the stuff and they looked at the menswear, including a Vivienne Westwood tartan suit we had.
Well, I mean, it's the same with the makeup of the courses. So teaching curation, and 90% of the students are women.
As they are in fashion.
Full of guys.
As they are in fashion. But how many people came? What was the sort of ratio
it was
for
almost
yours?
50-50.
Was it?
Yeah.
For Invisible Men,
Invisible Men, that is.
Supposed to be really targeted. As far as I'm really interested in audiences, I use exhibitions to reach audiences, and so it's thinking about what they might see, which is
And CP Company in Darwin was majority male by far. Because those people, those men primarily, who know that brand, they will travel long distances to come and see those brands.
It's the familiarity of what you're saying. I mean, for example, when I think about how the V&A market and advertise, and you talked earlier about the idea of the image and how people perceive things, it's that instantaneous element. It's what is that what the value and importance of that singular image will determine what that exhibition is about and speak volumes more than any written down phrase or anything else. It's the visual element. And in life, when you start out as a child, you're bombarded with the visual elements, and you talked today in your talks about the tactility of things and the senses and all of that. The strongest sense in that moment is what you see. And that is how you reach your audience, by that singular image. You don't need.
I think that's also.
You just need that image.
I think that's also what EJ was saying earlier about taking the museum to the community that you want to address. So I guess that's what you were doing in your example. And also, there's a really interesting museum in Lewisham Shopping Centre, the Museum of Migration.
Fantastic.
And the Museum of Homelessness just won the best temporary exhibition award last night or the night before, and all their work is pop up, and they won it at the Museum Awards. They're doing really, really, really important work, really super important work. And they're going out to and reaching the communities instead of expecting homeless people to come into the museum where they're not allowed to come in anymore because you're not allowed to linger in museums anymore.
I think. Should we have one? Should we have two last questions?
Yes, 2 last questions.
And then Lorraine.
I was thinking that all this amazing work that you're doing, and it reminded me of a conversation that I had with somebody. So I'm thinking about masculinities. I'm thinking about all the barriers to masculinities, clothes, men, gender. All the challenges that presents to men enjoying clothing, however we're going to term it. So I was driving down whatever road that is with Harrods, and you get to Harrods on the left.
Road.
Thank you. Harrods on the left, and I'm driving with a partner, and I'm so excited. Harrods, I say. And then I go, and my favourite building's coming up on the right shortly, the V&A. And without missing a beat, he said, That's for people who've got nothing better to do with their time.
It's a class issue. It's a class issue.
Clearly that relationship didn't last long.
Open the door.
The pop-ups are a great idea about getting things out to people so that then they're willing to come in to the spaces. But I think we're fighting so many different Venn diagram overlapping things that we just I don't know, need to
We're in bubbles, aren't we? That's the trouble.
We're in bubbles, I think.
We almost need to be, I don't know, masculinity is by stealth.
This gentleman.
Imagine that, of course, with the work you've been doing, there's also had a lot of advertising material, advertising shirts and types of sale. I was like, have you ever noticed a reluctance to actually say that, this pink shirt is pink? Well, think about, I've noticed times when we just say, it's not pink, it's salmon, it's pink.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's magenta. Rather than saying it's pink. Notice the reluctance to actually admit, men can have pink shirts. I mean, I'm pretty admit I'm not a fan of the colour pink. I don't know how that's more of a personal taste in colours. But at the same time, I'm just thinking, why are you dancing around it? Why not just call it pink? So notice that things that in men's clothing there is a reluctance to say, it's a pink shirt.
Euphemisms.
Euphemisms, yeah, absolutely. Salmon in particular. Anyway.
I love salmon. I've got a nice bit of salmon.
I like coral. But anyway, there we go.
My iPhone's actually called Coral. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a lovely colour.
As
Yeah,
opposed to salmon.
The fashion world does like, doesn't it, to not call something the generic of the colour.
Yes.
It does like to kind of sell it on.
Yeah, because it elevates it.
On that, not just with pink, and I think there is still that association, isn't there? With, I know lots of men do wear pink, but there's still a slight association of wearing pink. The only time I've ever been wolf whistled in the street was when I was wearing pink trousers.
I think pink trousers totally. It depends on the item. A pink shirt, a city
Surprise
shirt.
you later, Sean. Exactly. You get out there, those blue trousers, and watch what happens.
I'm quite happy this is sort of degenerated. I think we should pick this up in a discussion after Ben's address, where there will be wine, and in fact, Charlie and I need
We're just going to go and get the fizz now.
Thank you very much to the panel, to Jay and Charlie, who are going to run around like mad people and get some booze lined up. I'm going to end in a very, very short time, I promise you. I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things I said at the start today, just to help us think through how we move forward, perhaps. And also, I'm just picking up on some phrases, some words, some sentences that our presenters have said today, just as a gentle reminder to our brains as we move away from the day, thinking through what happens next. And I was thinking about let's build on one another's ideas and questions. Listen carefully and attentively. Talk with each other, not past each other. And thinking of the idea of the co-creation, co-curation. So, following on from that, there was a few other words that I wanted to think through, and that was around the idea, and I think Alistair picked up on it, and a few other people picked up on it, around articulating what is this thing, what are these things that we're exploring. The idea of building representation and equitability, identities, pluralities, and also testing our assumptions. What's happening there when we assume? I also picked up on things, very basic things, like doing something matters. It does matter what we do, even if it's a very small thing. And the idea of exposing and revealing process, of what we do and why, making things obvious. And again, that refers back to this idea of simplicity. Keep it simple is often the best advice anyone could ever give you. I also thought about situating terminology. We've all realized how difficult it is to pin down. In the last discussion, of course, they were talking about what is masculinities? What is masculinity? How do you define that? Has anyone defined that? And then I was thinking of the words as they were talked by other people around collaboration and the formative effects of language and how much language impacts on how we're thinking, what we're doing, how we're feeling. And then I had to include this one, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to be able to say it, vestimentary desire. Let's not forget that. I loved it. And what are we interested in beyond us? Think on. The vividness of images and the vividness of objects, what imaginary things they bring up in our memories. The eloquence of objects and language. And when we have objects, what do we do with them? Question mark. And the desire for something to be what we want it to be. Again, thinking about assumption and what we're doing with our assumptions. There's also this idea of, again, when I said earlier, I was half joking about the idea of the dispersal strategy. If there's an alarm, run out the door, run to the hills, don't look back for 20 minutes. And I thought also of dispersal. Where do things go? How do we recapture them? Or maybe we don't. And the more opportunities to engage with objects, the better for everyone, including curators, researchers. And someone mentioned slice through the ideas and how that enables more interrogation. And, oh God, I can't read my own writing now. Where are we? Yeah, here we are. This one was quite eloquent, quite beautiful. It's very metaphorical. Are the shadows right? And how do the shadows fall? Question mark. Virtual circles, ways of collecting objects, use of objects, and the narratives of objects. Think about the cyclic nature. The idea, a very beautiful metaphor again, of the archetypes, the originals, the copies, but what else? Playing with scale, and I'm not just talking about physical scale either. The technical and the functional, again that came up at the end, functionality, again it's about language, how we use language and how we use objects. The value of masculine attire. And then, where did I come to? Where are we? Yes, having other voices in our collecting and curatorial practice. Looking to the senses, our reactions recorded, our feelings explored. Capturing the public and the private masculine body. Memory and recollection. And what remains of us when we are gone. There was also a few other words which are rich, and I'm thinking of deviation and drifting and unpicking, and maybe that's what we need to do with the subject. Different forms of masculinities, letting the objects do the talking. And the difficulty, as I mentioned earlier, of defining masculinities. I'm repeating myself now, but maybe there's a reason. And maybe not expecting to find out any neat and tidy definitions and boundaries. Maybe we have to play, and I use that word purposely, with the messiness of this all. Expand our understandings of what definitions are and what they do. And let's not forget, we are all Venn diagrams. And some people, oh my God, my writing. Some people need different spaces to engage with objects. Where do we engage with them? How do we engage with them? How do we reach them? On their own terms? In their own spaces? Let's discuss. It seems to be working. Let's follow through with the idea. And how objects change over time. And I think that's a very metaphorically rich idea to explore. The physicality of displaying exhibitions and exhibition making. And finally, who are our audiences? Where are they? And how to reach them. It's all about engagement. So thank you, everyone, for today. It's been really interesting. We have had this recorded. Thank you very much, Ikenna, for doing all the recording and all the IT stuff. Without him, I would have cried. Wherever you are, Ikenna, thank you. Thank you to Sis, who I think is helping Sis. Sis, I think is, yeah, Sis is with the bubbles. And thank you very much, everyone. Head through to the cafe refectory if you have any time at all. It would be lovely to talk to you a bit more.
And thanks to Ben.
Yeah.